Picture the Pacific Ocean in the summer of 1942, not as you know it from photographs or films. Picture it without satellites, without real-time communications, without any certainty at all. Picture a world where the most powerful naval force on the planet was sailing toward a tiny coral atoll, two small islands, barely large enough to hold an airstrip and a handful of fuel tanks, absolutely convinced it would win. And picture, on the other side of that ocean, 3 aircraft carriers, a codebreaker who had not slept in 3 days, and an admiral who had just been told he was outnumbered 4-1. Now, ask yourself this. Which side do you think history remembers? The Battle of Midway lasted 4 days. But the decisions that shaped those 4 days had been building for 6 months. Through catastrophe, through humiliation, through smoke and salt and silence at the bottom of the Pacific. What happened between the 4th and 7th of June, 1942, was not simply a naval engagement. It was the moment the war in the Pacific changed direction, and it changed direction not because of superior numbers or superior firepower, but because of intelligence, ingenuity, and decisions made in basement rooms by men who rarely made it into the headlines. This is not a simple story of heroism. It is not a story without its failures or its tragedies. Men made mistakes at Midway. Commanders hesitated. Aircraft flew in the wrong direction. Ships caught fire when they should not have. And yet, through all of that, through every miscalculation and missed opportunity, the outcome of those 4 days reshaped the balance of power in an entire ocean. If you want to understand how wars are truly won and truly lost, then stay with us, because this story is about all of it. Chapter 1, A World on Fire, the Pacific in December 1941. Before there was a battle at Midway, there was a morning at Pearl Harbor. Before there was a morning at Pearl Harbor, there was a strategy, a cold, calculated bet by the Imperial Japanese Navy that they could end a war before it truly began. And before any of that, there was a decade of tension, expansion, and the quiet, grinding machinery of empire moving across Asia and the Pacific with a momentum that most of the world either did not see or did not wish to acknowledge. To understand why Midway happened, you must first understand what made it necessary. The road to the 4th of June, 1942, began long before any bomb fell on Hawaiian soil. It began in the assumptions that empires make when they believe their power to be inevitable. On the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, a Sunday, approximately 360 aircraft from the carriers of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's strike force descended on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack was meticulously planned, precisely executed, and devastating in its initial effect. All 8 United States battleships present were struck, with 5 sunk and 1 heavily damaged. 3 destroyers were sunk. Nearly 300 United States Army, Navy, and Marine Corps aircraft were destroyed or damaged on the ground. In a single morning, the calculus of Pacific power had been violently rearranged. But here is what the architects of that attack did not achieve. And this is where the story truly begins. The United States Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor that morning. They were at sea. The USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga were absent from the harbor, and their absence meant that the single most consequential class of warship in the coming Pacific War survived the opening blow entirely intact. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and the man who had reluctantly endorsed the Pearl Harbor attack, understood this better than most. He had warned, before the attack was launched, that the operation might awaken a sleeping giant. The carrier fleet, still alive and unharmed, meant that Giant was not merely awake, it was armed. The United States formally entered the Second World War on the 8th of December, 1941. Within days, Japan's allies in the Axis, Germany and Italy, declared war on the United States, transforming what had been a European conflict with American material support into a genuinely global war. President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, meeting in Washington at the end of December, made a strategic decision that would govern Allied planning for the next 3 years. Europe first. The defeat of Nazi Germany would take priority, while the Pacific would be held on the defensive. For a navy that had just watched its battleship Roe reduced to charred steel and shallow water, that assignment, hold the Pacific, must have seemed almost impossibly grim. The weeks that followed Pearl Harbor did nothing to improve the picture. Japan moved with extraordinary speed across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Malaya fell, Singapore fell, the largest surrender in British military history. The Dutch East Indies, rich in oil and rubber, were seized. The Philippines were invaded. Wake Island fell after a fierce resistance. In less than 3 months, Japan had assembled an empire stretching thousands of kilometers across the Pacific and into Southeast Asia. The men directing the Imperial Japanese Navy looked at that map and saw not an empire to be defended, but a perimeter to be extended. The logic of expansion, once begun, seemed to carry its own irresistible momentum. And yet, within that momentum, there were cracks. Yamamoto, a complex and strategically sophisticated figure who had studied in the United States and understood American industrial capacity, recognized that Japan had perhaps 18 months, possibly less, before American production swung the balance irrevocably. The Japanese strategy, at its core, was a wager on time. Seize enough territory, create a defensive perimeter strong enough, and force the United States into a negotiated settlement. Before American factories and American training programs could overwhelm Japanese strength with sheer volume, it was not an irrational strategy, but it required the destruction of the United States Pacific Fleet, not merely its bruising. And the carrier fleet, still intact, made that destruction far from guaranteed. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor on the 31st of December, 1941, to assume command of the Pacific Fleet, taking over from Admiral Husband Kimmel, who had been relieved in the aftermath of the attack. What Nimitz found was a fleet in shock, a harbor still scarred by the events of 3 weeks earlier, and a strategic situation that offered precious few options. He accurately summarized the moment in his earliest assessments. The loss of the battleships had committed the United States to the strategic defensive until forces could be rebuilt. But Nimitz was not a man who read a difficult situation and accepted its worst implications. He read it and began looking for the opportunities that even the worst situations contain. He would find them. But first, his navy would have to survive a great deal more damage. The first months of 1942 tested the resilience of every institution the United States Navy possessed. Carrier task forces conducted raids on Japanese-held islands, the Marshall Islands, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island. These raids inflicted limited damage, but demonstrated something important. The Pacific Fleet was not passive. It was looking for ways to strike back, to complicate Japanese planning, to refuse the role of victim. The Japanese High Command was watching those raids carefully, and they were forming conclusions about American intentions. Those conclusions would shape the strategy that led directly to Midway. Every action in war produces a reaction. and the reaction Japan was developing in the early months of 1942 would set the stage for everything that followed. For the men serving on the carriers and the men working in the intelligence offices at Pearl Harbor and in Washington, these months were defined by two opposing sensations: urgency and uncertainty. The urgency was obvious. Japan was moving fast, and every day of inaction was a day lost. The uncertainty was deeper and more corrosive. What was Japan's next target? Where would the next blow fall? The Pacific was an enormous ocean, and three carriers, however capable, could not be everywhere at once. The answer to those questions, the question of what Japan was planning next, would not come from reconnaissance aircraft or fleet sightings. It would come from a basement in Hawaii, from a group of men staring at columns of encoded signals, armed with nothing but mathematics and exceptional stubbornness. The codebreakers were already at work. What makes the events of December 1941 to June 1942 so compelling is not the scale of the catastrophe at one end or the triumph at the other. It is the distance between them. The United States Navy that fought at Midway was, in almost every measurable respect, inferior to the force it faced. Fewer ships, fewer aircraft, less experienced pilots. A carrier fleet outnumbered 4-3. And yet it won, not by matching Japanese strength, but by knowing where that strength was going to be. The road from Pearl Harbor to Midway is, at its heart, a story about how nations respond when they are at their weakest, and whether that response is shaped by fear or by intelligence. In this case, it was shaped by both, and the combination proved, against all expectation, to be enough. Chapter 2: The Giant Stirs, America's Recovery, and the Doolittle Raid. There is something important to understand about the United States in the first months of 1942. It was not a nation in collapse. It was a nation in shock, which is a fundamentally different thing. Shock is temporary. It gives way to anger, and anger, if it is organized correctly, gives way to action. The American industrial economy, the largest on the planet, had not been touched by the attack at Pearl Harbor. The shipyards were intact. The steel mills were running. The training programs were beginning to fill with young men who had seen the newsreels from Hawaii and made a decision. What the United States lacked in December 1941 was not capacity. It was time. The question was whether it could buy enough of it. Admiral Nimitz understood this arithmetic clearly. He could not match the Japanese combined fleet ship for ship, not yet, but he could use what he had aggressively and intelligently. The carrier raids of early 1942, against the Marshall Islands in February, against Wake Island and Marcus Island in the weeks that followed, were not designed to be strategically decisive. They were designed to show the Japanese that the Pacific Fleet was still alive and willing to fight. They were designed to give American crews experience under real combat conditions, and they were designed to set the stage for something more ambitious. A strike that would shake Japanese confidence in a way that nothing in their strategic planning had anticipated. On the 18th of April, 1942, 16 Army Air Forces B-25 Mitchell bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, took off from the deck of the USS Hornet, approximately 650 miles off the Japanese coast. The technical feat alone was remarkable. B-25s were not carrier aircraft, and no one had ever launched medium bombers from a carrier deck in combat before. The strike targeted Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The physical damage inflicted was limited. Fires burned in Tokyo and other cities, but the industrial infrastructure of Japan was essentially unharmed. By the metrics of conventional bombing doctrine, the Doolittle raid was a modest operation. By every other metric, it was transformative. The psychological effect in Japan was immediate and profound. For nearly 6 months since Pearl Harbor, Japanese citizens had been told, and crucially, believed, that the home islands were beyond the reach of American power. The Pacific perimeter their forces had built was a wall, and behind that wall Japan was safe. The Doolittle raid shattered that belief in a single afternoon. Fires burned in districts of Tokyo that were nowhere near any military target. The imperial government moved quickly to censor news of the attack, but censorship cannot unburn a building that people can see from the street. Doubt entered the Japanese public consciousness, and in the corridors of the Imperial High Command, doubt became urgency. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, where had they come from, and how could it be prevented from happening again? The answer the Japanese High Command reached was Midway. The tiny atoll, sitting roughly halfway across the Pacific, was identified as the most likely launch point for any future strikes against the home islands. A conclusion that was operationally incorrect, since the Doolittle aircraft had actually been launched from a carrier, not from a land base. But the miscalculation proved consequential. Admiral Yamamoto, who had been developing plans for an operation in the Central Pacific, found that the Doolittle raid had silenced the opposition within the Imperial Navy's planning councils. There had been debate about whether to strike next in the South Pacific, toward Australia, or in the Central Pacific, toward Midway and Hawaii. After the 18th of April, 1942, that debate effectively ended. Midway would be seized, the American carrier fleet would be drawn out and destroyed. The Pacific War would be decided. In the United States, the effect of the Doolittle raid was precisely what planners had hoped for. The mission boosted public morale at a moment when the news from Asia and the Pacific had been almost unrelentingly dark. Here was proof that American forces could strike at the heart of Japan, that the war was not entirely on Japan's terms. Doolittle himself was awarded the Medal of Honor, but the deeper significance of the raid was strategic. It had forced a Japanese response. It had accelerated a Japanese decision that, once made, would give the United States its opportunity, provided that American intelligence could figure out what that decision was, where it was directed, and when it would be carried out. The codebreakers at Station HYPO were already working on precisely those questions. Meanwhile, in the South Pacific, the war's next major naval engagement was already taking shape. Japan was moving to extend its perimeter southward toward Port Moresby in New Guinea and the island of Tulagi in the Solomons. Control of Port Moresby would give Japanese forces an air base capable of threatening northeastern Australia, a prospect that alarmed both American and Australian planners. A Japanese carrier force was dispatched to support the operation, and Admiral Nimitz, drawing on intelligence intercepts, dispatched 2 of his own carrier task forces to intercept it. The resulting engagement, fought in the Coral Sea in early May of 1942, was the first naval battle in history in which the opposing surface ships never came within visual range of each other. The entire battle was fought by aircraft, from carriers that never saw each other directly. The Battle of the Coral Sea was, in tactical terms, a costly draw. The United States lost the fleet carrier USS Lexington, a significant and painful blow. The carrier USS Yorktown was struck by a Japanese bomb that penetrated 5 decks and exploded internally, killing and injuring dozens of crew members, rupturing fuel tanks, and causing structural damage that naval engineers who examined the ship would estimate required at minimum 90 days of repair work. Japan lost the light carrier Shoho and suffered serious damage to the fleet carrier Shokaku. Damage serious enough to keep both Shokaku and the carrier Zuikaku out of the upcoming Midway operation. That last fact would prove to be one of the most consequential results of the entire Coral Sea engagement, though no one could know it at the time. Strategically, however, the Coral Sea battle was an American victory. The Japanese invasion force, bound for Port Moresby, turned back. The southward extension of the Japanese perimeter had been checked, at least temporarily, and two of Japan's most experienced carrier air groups, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the pilots who had trained for years and accumulated combat experience that could not be quickly replaced, were now either damaged or depleted. The mathematics of Japanese carrier power, already stretched by the Doolittle raid's political consequences, were quietly shifting in ways that the Imperial Navy's planners had not fully accounted for. Meanwhile, the Yorktown was limping back toward Pearl Harbor, carrying her dead and her wounded, with a bomb hole that everyone who looked at it agreed could not be fixed in time for whatever came next. Everyone, that is, except Admiral Nimitz. The spring of 1942 was, in retrospect, the fulcrum on which the entire Pacific War balanced. On one side sat Japan, still powerful, still confident, still holding the initiative, but beginning to accumulate the debts that overextension always charges. On the other sat the United States, wounded, outnumbered in almost every category, but possessed of something that no amount of firepower can purchase: accurate knowledge of the enemy's intentions. That knowledge was being assembled, piece by painstaking piece, in a basement at Pearl Harbor, in a room that smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, and the particular tension of men who understand that what they are doing matters enormously and must be done perfectly. The story of the Doolittle raid and the Coral Sea battle had set the board. Now, the codebreakers were about to reveal the next move. Chapter 3, The Men in the Basement, Station HYPO and the Breaking of JN-25 beneath the Pearl Harbor Naval Headquarters, building in a basement room known officially as the Combat Intelligence Unit and unofficially as the Dungeon. A group of cryptanalysts and linguists were doing work that would never fully appear in the battle summaries or the official after-action reports. They worked in shifts that blurred into continuous consciousness. The room was dim, perpetually warm, and saturated with the sounds of teletype machines and the scratch of pencils against graph paper. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the officer in charge, was by most accounts an eccentric figure. He worked in a bathrobe and carpet slippers, kept irregular hours, and possessed a capacity for sustained analytical concentration that his colleagues found both impressive and faintly alarming. He had been placed in command of Station HYPO because Leighton Safford, a senior Navy cryptologist, had recognized in Rochefort a particular quality. He could hold enormous quantities of partial information in his mind simultaneously and find the pattern within it. The code Rochefort's team was working to break was designated JN-25, the primary operational code of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was not a simple cipher. It was a complex system that required, among other things, the identification of code groups, the reconstruction of code books, and the analysis of message traffic patterns over time to establish context for messages whose content could not be directly read. By the spring of 1942, Rochefort's team, working in coordination with cryptanalytic units in Melbourne, Australia, and in Washington, had made sufficient progress with JN-25 to extract partial meaning from a significant proportion of intercepted messages. Not everything was readable. Large portions of traffic remained opaque. But the fragments that could be read were beginning to assemble into a picture. By late April of 1942, the picture was becoming alarming. Intercepted traffic pointed toward a major Japanese operation in the Central Pacific, scheduled for early June. A target designation kept appearing in the messages. 2 letters, the letters A and F. Rochefort's analysis of signal traffic patterns and geographic context led him to believe that AF meant Midway Atoll, but Washington was not convinced. The Naval Intelligence Directorate in Washington held that AF was more likely a reference to the Hawaiian Islands themselves. This disagreement was not a minor bureaucratic dispute. If Washington was right and Rochefort was wrong, Admiral Nimitz would position his carriers to defend Hawaii, and the Japanese would land unopposed on Midway. If Rochefort was right, everything depended on acting on that information correctly. The stakes of the disagreement were the entire outcome of the operation. What Rochefort did next is one of the most elegantly simple acts of strategic intelligence in the history of modern warfare. Working with Captain Wilfred Holmes, Rochefort arranged for the garrison at Midway to broadcast an uncoded radio message, sent over a secure undersea cable from Pearl Harbor to the atoll, reporting that the island's water purification system had broken down. The message was transmitted in the clear, easily intercepted by Japanese signal intelligence. Within days, Japanese communications traffic began mentioning that AF was experiencing a shortage of fresh water. The Japanese had confirmed in their own signal traffic that AF was Midway. Rochefort's analysis was correct, and in a single act of elegant deception, the most important intelligence question of the entire Pacific campaign had been answered. Washington, even after the AF deception confirmed Midway as the target, was not fully persuaded. There was institutional resistance, the kind that forms when one organization's conclusion directly contradicts another's, and both organizations have something invested in being right. The Naval Intelligence Directorate in Washington continued to argue that the main Japanese thrust might be directed at the Hawaiian Islands or even the west coast of the United States. Rochefort and his immediate supporter, Admiral Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer, pressed their case with data. The volume of signal traffic, the specific geographic references, the logistics patterns visible in the intercepts. Nimitz listened to both arguments, and then he made a decision that required him to trust his codebreakers over his Washington counterparts. It was one of the most consequential command decisions of the war. The date of the Japanese operation was the next critical question. Partial decryption of Japanese traffic had established that the attack was planned for a window in early June, but the precise date had not been pinned down. Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan, working within Rochefort's team, discovered the method Japan used to encrypt datetime groups within its message traffic, using that method to reanalyze previously intercepted messages. The team established that the date of the Japanese attack on Midway was either the 4th or 5th of June, 1942. An intercept dated the 26th of May, carrying orders for 2 destroyer groups escorting invasion transports, confirmed the operational timeline. Rochefort had the target. He had the date. He had the Japanese order of battle. The full composition of forces committed to the operation. He now needed to put all of it in front of an admiral who could act on it. What Station HYPO had assembled by the last days of May 1942 was remarkable not just in its accuracy, but in its completeness. Rochefort and his team could tell Nimitz that Japan's Kido Butai, the first carrier striking force, would approach Midway from the northwest. They could identify the 4 fleet carriers in that force, a Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They could identify the overall Japanese operational commander as Admiral Yamamoto, sailing with the main body aboard the super battleship Yamato more than 300 miles behind the carrier force. They could describe the diversion toward the Aleutian Islands that Japan planned to launch simultaneously, intended to draw American attention northward. This was not guesswork. It was the result of months of sustained analytical work by men who had broken one of the most sophisticated military codes in active use against a deadline that allowed no margin for error. It is worth pausing here to consider what this intelligence represented in terms of the broader history of warfare, the ability to know, with reasonable confidence, the composition, route, and timing of an enemy operation before it begins, is a force multiplier of extraordinary power. It does not guarantee victory. Knowing where the enemy is going does not tell you everything about how the battle will unfold when you get there. Wars are fought by human beings in conditions of fear and exhaustion and mechanical failure, and all of those factors produce outcomes that no intelligence analysis can fully predict. But knowing is still enormously better than not knowing. The Americans who sailed toward Midway in late May of 1942 sailed with a gift that their opponents did not even know they had given, and everything that followed was shaped by it. There is, however, a painful postscript to the story of Station HYPO and Joseph Rochefort that must be told here, because it speaks to something true about how institutions respond to individuals who turn out to be right when institutions told them they were wrong. After the Battle of Midway, Rochefort was nominated for the Distinguished Service Medal in recognition of his team's contribution to the victory. The nomination was rejected, blocked, according to historical accounts, by figures within the Naval Intelligence Directorate in Washington, whose own analysis had been contradicted by Rochefort's work. He was reassigned from Station HYPO to a floating dry dock command in California, a posting that represented, in the culture of the Naval Officer Corps, a profound professional demotion. The medal he was denied in life was awarded posthumously decades later. The gap between the debt owed and the recognition given is one of the stranger and sadder chapters in the history of American naval intelligence. What matters most in the story we are telling here is what the work of Rochefort and his colleagues made possible. Because of them, Admiral Nimitz did not have to guess. He did not have to disperse his carriers across the Pacific in the hope that one of them might stumble onto the Japanese force in time. He could concentrate his 3 carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the battered, barely repaired Yorktown, at a precisely calculated intercept position northeast of Midway, and wait. The Japanese would sail toward the atoll, expecting to find an empty ocean and a surprised garrison. Instead, they would find 3 carriers already in position, already knowing they were coming. The trap had been set entirely by mathematics and signal analysis. From a basement in Pearl Harbor, by a man in a bathrobe and carpet slippers who had not slept properly in weeks. Chapter 4. The Ghost Ship, Yorktown's Impossible Resurrection. On the 27th of May, 1942, the USS Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor. She was trailing oil. Her hull had been opened by near misses from Japanese bombs. Somewhere deep inside her, a structural wound from a direct hit during the Coral Sea battle was compromising the integrity of the ship's internal frames and beams. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who had been aboard Yorktown during the Coral Sea action, estimated that returning the ship to combat readiness would take approximately 90 days. And that was the aggressive estimate. The standard assessment was that she needed to be transferred to the Naval shipyard at Puget Sound, Washington, for extensive repairs that would keep her out of action for months. What Yorktown's crew could not have known as they brought their battered ship into harbor was that their admiral had just been told when the next Japanese attack would occur, and it was less than a week away. Admiral Nimitz went aboard the Yorktown to conduct his own assessment. He walked the damaged spaces. He looked at the torn structural members and the flooded compartments and the burned equipment. And then he said something that the men around him remembered for the rest of their lives. He said that he needed this ship back in 3 days, not 3 weeks, not the 90 days that the standard engineering survey required. 3 days. The engineers and shipyard workers who heard those words were confronted with an impossible equation. The structural damage to Yorktown's hull involved twisted and torn frames and deck beams that had to be repaired or replaced to prevent catastrophic weakening. The fuel tanks required patching. The flight deck needed work. The internal spaces were a chaos of fire damage and flood damage and mechanical failure. There was no scenario by any standard naval engineering metric in which 3 days was sufficient. What happened next at Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard is, by any honest measure, one of the most extraordinary industrial feats of the Second World War. More than 1,400 civilian workers descended on the Yorktown in Dry Dock Number 1, working in shifts around the clock. The repair approach they adopted was radically expedient. Structural frames and beams that could not be properly replaced in the time available were instead reinforced with wooden shoring, temporary bracing that would hold the ship together well enough for combat, even if it did not restore her to full engineering specification. Steel plates were cut to match damaged sections, wooden templates were built to ensure the fit was correct, and each plate was riveted or welded into place one by one. More than 20 steel beams and bulkheads were replaced in this fashion. The ship's service facilities, the soda fountain, the store, the laundry rooms, were deliberately left unrepaired. There was no time, and they were not what the ship needed to fight. The workers at Pearl Harbor had a model of urgency to draw on, a painful one. The loss of the USS Lexington at the Coral Sea, which had burned uncontrollably after damage to her aviation fuel systems, had prompted hard analysis of what went wrong and what could be done differently. Yorktown's damage control teams had begun implementing lessons from that loss even before the ship reached harbor. When they returned to sea, they would go equipped with improved procedures for fuel system isolation and fire suppression. The specific category of improvements that would, in a matter of days, save the ship's life under circumstances that should by all rights have finished her. The knowledge purchased with the Lexington's loss was already being transferred into practice. That is what learning in wartime looks like. Costly, unglamorous, and indispensable. On the 29th of May, 1942, 2 days after arriving at Pearl Harbor, 1 day ahead of even Nimitz's compressed schedule, USS Yorktown was floated out of Dry Dock Number 1. She was not fully repaired. She would not pass a peacetime engineering inspection. The repairs were functional rather than complete, structural rather than cosmetic. But she was capable of making fleet speed, launching and recovering aircraft, and absorbing punishment, which is exactly what she was about to be asked to do. 1,400 men had worked around the clock with cutting torches and welding rigs, and the particular focused energy of people who understand that what they are doing is urgent. In the most literal sense, the ship they sent back to sea was, in an important way, a different ship from the one that had entered harbour, not because she was better repaired, but because she was better understood. Her crew knew what she could take. The Japanese, for their part, believed the Yorktown was out of the war. Their intelligence assessment, based on damage reports from the Coral Sea battle, had calculated that the carrier would be under repair for a minimum of several months, possibly permanently lost. This was not an unreasonable assessment by conventional standards. It was the assessment that any competent naval engineer would have made looking at the damage reports, but it was fatally incorrect. When the Japanese order of battle was assembled for the Midway operation, it was constructed on the assumption that the United States had only two operational carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet. Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, the third American carrier, which would form Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, was considered to be in a shipyard somewhere, unable to fight. That miscalculation had consequences that would reverberate across the entire battle. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance is worth pausing on here, because his presence at Midway was itself the result of a circumstance, rather than a plan. Vice Admiral William Halsey, one of the most aggressive and experienced carrier commanders in the Pacific Fleet, had been scheduled to lead Task Force 16 into battle. But Halsey had developed a severe skin condition, psoriasis that had become debilitating, and was hospitalized just days before the fleet sailed. He could not go. The task force needed a commander. Halsey, in what was perhaps his finest judgment call of the war, recommended Spruance, a cruiser commander with no experience commanding carrier forces in combat. Spruance was calm, precise, and deeply analytical. He was not a flamboyant commander. He was not the kind of officer who inspired dramatic stories at dinner tables. He would prove, in the days ahead, to be exactly the kind of commander the situation required. The fleet that sailed from Pearl Harbor in the last days of May 1942 was outgunned in nearly every category. The Japanese combined fleet committed to the Midway operation numbered more than 200 ships. The Americans would bring 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers to the decisive engagement. Along with the aircraft and garrison, forces based on Midway itself. In terms of total naval power, the comparison was not even close. But total naval power is not what decides battles. What decides battles is the power applied at the decisive point, at the decisive moment. And the Americans, because of Rochefort's intelligence, knew exactly where and when that moment would come. They were sailing not blindly into a fight, but to a precisely calculated ambushed position, northeast of Midway, at a location they named Point Luck. The name was chosen deliberately. What they would need, in addition to everything else, was at least some of it. As the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown steamed away from Pearl Harbor, the men aboard them knew the general situation, but not the full picture. The officers at the command level had been briefed. The carrier pilots had been given their intelligence summaries. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew the Japanese carriers would be coming from the northwest. They knew the attack was expected on the 4th or 5th of June. What they did not know, what no one could know, was how the battle would actually unfold. Which choices would prove correct, which aircraft would find their targets, which moments of hesitation would cost lives, and which moments of initiative would save them. They were sailing into a fog of war that all the intelligence in the world could only partially penetrate. The codebreakers had given them the map. The men in the aircraft were going to have to navigate it themselves. Point Luck was a position roughly 325 kilometers northeast of Midway. It had been calculated by Nimitz's staff as the optimal intercept position, close enough to Midway to respond to an attack on the atoll, far enough north to avoid early detection by Japanese search aircraft. The three carriers arrived there and began the wait. Reconnaissance aircraft from Midway were already flying as search patterns to the northwest, looking for the Japanese fleet. The garrison on the atoll, Marines, Army Air Forces aircraft, Navy patrol planes, had been reinforced to the maximum extent the logistics could support. Every aircraft that could be found and sent to Midway had been sent. The atoll was never going to be able to stop a Japanese invasion by itself. But it was well enough armed to present a genuine threat, and a genuine threat was what Nimitz needed it to be. The Kido Butai was sailing toward what it expected to be a routine operation. What it was sailing toward, in reality, was an ambush in the middle of the Pacific, set by a man in a bathrobe who had not been wrong yet. Chapter 5. The Giant Wakes. Yamamoto's plan and its hidden fractures. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was, by the spring of 1942, one of the most powerful naval commanders on Earth. He commanded the Japanese Combined Fleet, an armada that, by any objective count of hulls and aircraft and firepower, dwarfed anything the United States could currently place in the Pacific. He was also, by most accounts, deeply skeptical of the enterprise he was about to launch. Yamamoto had opposed the war with the United States from the beginning. He understood American industrial power in a way that many of his colleagues did not, having spent time in the country as a student and a naval attaché. He had told Japan's civilian leadership before Pearl Harbor that he could promise vigorous action for the first 6 months, but that he could guarantee nothing beyond that. The Midway operation, in the spring of 1942, sat almost exactly at the boundary of those 6 months, and Yamamoto was preparing to bet everything on it. The plan Yamamoto had developed for the Midway operation was ambitious to the point of complexity. One historian described it as Byzantine, a plan so intricate in its moving parts that it assumed a level of coordination and communication that the realities of naval operations at sea made nearly impossible. The plan divided the combined fleet into no fewer than 10 separate formations, arrayed across an enormous expanse of ocean, with specific roles for each. At its core, the plan was built around a deception. A northern force, consisting of 2 light carriers, accompanied by cruisers and destroyers, would strike Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands, American territory, on the 3rd of June, intended to draw American carriers northward toward Alaska. Once the American carriers had committed to the Aleutian response, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai, the 4 fleet carriers, the battle-hardened core of Japanese naval aviation, would attack Midway from the northwest. Nagumo's aircraft would neutralize Midway's defenses, and an invasion force of approximately 5,000 troops would go ashore and occupy the atoll. The second phase of the plan was the decisive engagement, with Midway in Japanese hands and the American carriers rushing back from the Aleutians. They would sail into an ambush prepared by Yamamoto's main body. The super battleships and battleship groups that were positioned hundreds of kilometers behind the Kido Butai to administer the final blow to whatever remained of the American carrier fleet. It was a plan for a decisive victory. It was also a plan that contained, in its very complexity, the seeds of its own failure. The first fracture in the plan was geographical. The various Japanese formations were so widely separated that mutual support between them was essentially impossible. Yamamoto's main body, with the Yamato and the battleship groups, sat roughly 600 miles behind Nagumo's carriers, more than a full day's sailing. The Aleutian diversionary force was even further removed. This meant that if anything went wrong for Nagumo's carrier force at the decisive point of contact, there was no help within reach. The plan worked only if everything proceeded as designed. Naval battles, in the experience of any officer who had fought one, almost never proceeded as designed. The fog of war, the uncertainty, the friction, the misidentification and miscommunication and mechanical failure that attends every engagement would test a plan this complicated to its limits the moment contact was made. The second fracture was informational. Yamamoto's plan was built on assumptions about American dispositions that were critically incorrect. The plan assumed that the Americans did not know the target, did not know the date, and had no carrier forces positioned in the Central Pacific. All three assumptions were wrong, but the Japanese High Command had no mechanism to discover their error, because their intelligence collection was inadequate for the task. They relied primarily on radio traffic analysis and submarine reconnaissance, and both failed them at the crucial moment. The submarines assigned to patrol the approaches to Pearl Harbor, intended to report on American carrier movements, arrived on station too late to observe the carrier's departure. The radio silence that Nimitz had ordered for the American task forces was holding. Japan was sailing toward a battle it thought it understood against an opponent it thought it had located. It had done neither. The third fracture, perhaps the most consequential, was the absence of Shokaku and Zuikaku, the two fleet carriers damaged or depleted at the Coral Sea. These were not just any ships. Their air groups represented some of the most combat-experienced aviators in the Japanese carrier fleet. The damage to Shokaku and the aircraft losses suffered by Zuikaku's air group had been deemed sufficient to keep both carriers out of the Midway operation, even though the operation was less than a month away from the Coral Sea engagement. This was a planning failure of the First Order. The Japanese High Command had the option of delaying the Midway operations slightly to allow these units to recover. Yamamoto's own staff is recorded to have discussed this possibility. The decision to proceed on the original timeline without those two carriers and their experienced air groups would haunt the operation from its opening hours. Nagumo's Kidobutai was a force of formidable power by any conventional measure. Akagi was the flagship, a converted battlecruiser hull, large and well-equipped. Kaga was the second fleet carrier, similarly converted from a capital ship hull. Soryu and Hiryu were purpose-built fleet carriers, faster and more maneuverable than their older counterparts. Together they carried approximately 248 aircraft, along with pilots who had trained for years and accumulated combat experience across the Pacific campaign. The air groups of these four carriers had struck Pearl Harbor, had devastated British naval forces in the Indian Ocean, had participated in the raids on Darwin and Ceylon. They were, by the standards of June 1942, the most experienced carrier air force in the world. Nagumo commanded them from Akagi's bridge with a well-earned confidence, but that confidence contained a quiet assumption that would prove dangerous, that the operation would proceed without serious American interference. The Japanese had done the math on American carrier strength and concluded that, at most, 2 American carriers might be present, and possibly none if the Aleutian diversion succeeded in drawing them north. Nagumo's planning for the battle, therefore, did not heavily weight the possibility of encountering 3 American carriers in an ambush position already armed and launched before Japanese aircraft had even reached Midway. His aircraft sortie planning, his weapons loading protocols, his reserve strike procedures, all of them were designed for an operation that unfolded in a particular sequence. When the sequence broke down, the consequences of those planning assumptions would become catastrophic. Yamamoto himself, sailing aboard Yamato, hundreds of kilometers behind the action, was separated from the battle by both distance and by the communications discipline his own operational security demanded. The combined fleet was observing strict radio silence to avoid detection. That meant Yamamoto could not communicate freely with Nagumo as the operation developed. He could not intervene in real time if Nagumo's decisions seemed wrong. He could not redirect or reinforce. The commander of the greatest naval force then at sea in the Pacific had, by his own plan's requirements, effectively isolated himself from the ability to influence the battle at its most critical moments. His position 600 miles behind the carrier force was not an accident. It was by design, a feature of the deception strategy. It was also, as events would show, a catastrophic limitation. What Yamamoto's plan represented, in the cold light of historical analysis, was a bet on complexity in circumstances that reward simplicity. The plan needed the deception to work. It needed the Americans to react as predicted. It needed the timeline to hold. It needed all 10 formations to coordinate correctly across hundreds of kilometers of ocean without real-time communication. Any one of those requirements failing would degrade the plan. Several of them failing simultaneously would break it entirely, and the Americans, unknown to Yamamoto, had already ensured that the most fundamental assumption, surprise, would not hold. The Kido Butai was sailing toward Midway, across an ocean it believed to be empty. 3 American carriers were already waiting. The plan's fractures were structural, built in at the design stage, invisible until the moment of contact. That moment was now less than 2 weeks away. Chapter 6, Point Luck, The Gathering of Forces. The last days of May 1942 were marked by an unusual quiet across the central Pacific. The kind of quiet that precedes not calm, but collision. The Japanese armada was already at sea, its various formations strung across hundreds of kilometers of ocean, bound for their assigned positions. The American task forces were steaming northwest from Pearl Harbor toward a map coordinate that existed nowhere, except in the calculations of Admiral Nimitz's staff. Point Luck. The name had been chosen, as such names often are, with a full awareness of how much of what was about to happen lay beyond the reach of plans and preparations, and the particular gifts of Joseph, Rochefort's codebreakers. Intelligence could tell you where the enemy was going. It could not tell you whether your aircraft would find them, whether the weather would cooperate, whether the decisions made in the heat of contact would be the right ones. Those questions would be answered in the air, over the ocean, in the span of a few critical hours, days at most from now. Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher commanded Task Force 17 from the USS Yorktown, and by virtue of his seniority held overall tactical command of the combined American carrier forces. Fletcher was an experienced surface warfare officer and a competent flag officer, though history would judge some of his decisions at Midway with a mixed verdict. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the USS Enterprise, with the Hornet as his second carrier, was in the unique position of leading a carrier force in combat for the first time. A command he had received only because William Halsey's condition had put him in a hospital bed 10 days before the battle. Spruance had spent the voyage studying carrier doctrine intensively, consulting with Captain Miles Browning, Halsey's former chief of staff, and absorbing everything he could about how to employ the strike forces under his command. He was, by all accounts, a student in a class that offered no practice examinations. The men aboard those three carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, knew broadly what was coming. Nimitz had briefed his fleet commanders in detail, and the information had been shared down the chain of command to the flight crews and squadron leaders who would be directly responsible for executing the mission. The pilots of the carrier air groups knew they would be engaging the Kido Butai. They knew they were outnumbered in aircraft. Many of them knew that the aircraft they were flying, particularly the TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, aging and slow, were not well matched against the defenses they would encounter. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters were outperformed in several categories by Japan's Mitsubishi Zero. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers were solid aircraft, reliable and accurate, but they required their pilots to find the target, reach the target, and deliver their ordnance accurately in a dive that made them vulnerable to anti-aircraft, fire, and fighter interception. Every man who climbed into a cockpit on those carriers understood the arithmetic. On Midway itself, the garrison had been reinforced to the maximum practical extent. Admiral Nimitz had stripped everything available to strengthen the atoll's defenses. The Marine Corps aviation units on the island had been supplemented with Army Air Forces aircraft, including B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-26 Marauder medium bombers, along with Navy and Marine torpedo planes. Midway's total aircraft complement had been pushed to 127 aircraft. None of them were modern, first-line naval fighters. The Brewster Buffalo fighters, assigned to the Marine Fighter Squadron, were, by the standards of 1942 Pacific combat, already obsolescent. The pilots knew this too. But they were there, armed and committed to contesting the airspace over Midway as long and as aggressively as possible. Because the more attention the atoll's defenders drew, the more they complicated the calculations of the Japanese carrier commanders. Operating just beyond the horizon, PBY Catalina patrol planes, long-range maritime patrol aircraft, slow and unglamorous, but possessed of extraordinary endurance, were flying search patterns out of Midway across a sector that covered the anticipated Japanese approach routes. Nimitz needed as much early warning as possible. The plan to ambush the Kido Butai depended critically on the American carriers launching their strikes before the Japanese realized. They were there before Japanese search aircraft discovered the American task forces and reported their position. Every hour of additional warning was an hour in which the American strike groups could be airborne and inbound before Nagumo knew he was not attacking a surprised enemy. The Catalinas were the outermost layer of the intelligence that had already been assembled from decoded signals. They were the final confirmation system, the live eyes on the ocean that would turn Rochefort's calculations into a combat order. The logistical picture on the Japanese side was, by contrast, one of confident abundance. The invasion transports carried approximately 5,000 Thai troops for the Midway landing. The bombardment cruisers were in position. The invasion escort force was ready. The Kido Butai was fueled, armed, and had completed its transit without incident. Japanese morale was high. This was the force that had struck Pearl Harbor without warning, had ranged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans for 6 months without defeat, had watched one American carrier burn at the Coral Sea and claimed another damaged. The Japanese carrier air groups were by any objective measure among the finest in the world. The flyers of the Kido Butai had earned their confidence through demonstrated performance. What they had not earned what no military force can earn by any means other than experience, was knowledge of what they did not know. And what they did not know was positioned and waiting less than 400 kilometers to their northeast. The night of the 3rd of June, 1942, passed quietly over the Pacific. The Japanese Northern Force had already struck Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians. The diversionary attack intended to draw American attention northward. The attack achieved limited physical damage. It emphatically did not draw the American carriers north, because Nimitz's intelligence picture was clear enough that he recognized the Aleutian attack for what it was, a diversion. He left only limited forces to deal with it, and kept his 3 carriers exactly where Rochefort's analysis said they should be. The diversion had failed in its primary purpose before the main action had even begun. Yamamoto did not yet know this. He would not know it until the battle was over, and by then the knowledge would be academic. Early in the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, between 4:30 and 5 in the morning, in the darkness before nautical dawn, Nagumo's carriers turned into the wind and began launching the first strike wave against Midway. 108 aircraft rose from the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Fighters, horizontal bombers, dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga. The formation assembled in the darkness above the fleet and set course southeast for Midway, less than 300 kilometers distant. On the atoll, radar had already detected incoming aircraft. The warning went out. American fighters began scrambling from the runway. In the basement at Pearl Harbor, in the intelligence offices, in the chart rooms of 3 American carriers, holding position at Point Luck, no one slept. The battle that had been anticipated, planned, calculated, and waited for was beginning, right on schedule, in exactly the direction and at exactly the time that one man in carpet slippers had said it would. What happened in the next 5 hours would change the Pacific War irrevocably. The men at the center of it, Nagumo on his flagship's bridge, Spruance, Sprue, and Fletcher calculating attack timing, the dive bomber pilots climbing to altitude over a glittering ocean, the torpedo bomber crews flying straight and slow toward fleets ringed with fighters and anti-aircraft fire. None of them could see the full shape of what they were part of. They could only see their immediate horizon, the task in front of them, the choices available to them, the aircraft around them. The battle's outcome would be assembled from hundreds of individual decisions made in seconds by people who had incomplete information and no certainty about whether what they were doing would work. That is the nature of battle. That is why even the best intelligence cannot guarantee the result. It can only guarantee the opportunity. The stage was set. The forces were in position. The intelligence had done its work. The only thing left was the battle itself. And the battle was the hardest part of all. Chapter 7, The First Blow, Midway under attack. The sun had barely cleared the horizon on the 4th of June 1942, when Midway Atoll's radar screen lit up with the signature of approaching aircraft. The operator who read that return did not hesitate. The warning went out immediately. The entire garrison scrambling with the particular, organized urgency of men who had been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure. Every aircraft on the island that could fly was ordered airborne. It was better to be in the air, however uncertain, than on the ground when the bombs began falling. The Marines of Fighter Squadron 221 launched their Buffalos and their handful of Grumman, Wildcats, into the early morning sky. They were outnumbered. They were outclassed in the air. They knew it. They went anyway because the mission demanded it, and because the men on the ground below them depended on whatever time those fighters could buy. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's strike force of 108 aircraft swept in from the northwest in 3 distinct waves. Fighters leading, horizontal bombers following, dive bombers descending from altitude in coordinated patterns. The Marine fighter met them outside the atoll's perimeter, pressing attacks against a formation surrounded by Zero fighters that were, in the blunt arithmetic of aerial combat, superior to everything the Marines were flying. The Buffaloes were heavy and slow by comparison, and the Zero pilots were experienced veterans of months of Pacific combat. The engagement over Midway was, for the American fighter pilots, an act of desperate gallantry rather than a successful interception. They could disrupt and delay, harass and distract, but they could not stop 108 aircraft with a handful of fighters. No one had expected them to. What they bought was minutes, and minutes mattered. The bombs fell on Midway, beginning at approximately 6:30 in the morning. The Eastern and Sand Islands took hits across their facilities. The fuel storage areas were struck. The seaplane hangar was destroyed. The Marine barracks were hit. The power station was damaged. Anti-aircraft fire from the garrison threw up a dense screen. The Japanese bombers and fighters absorbed losses from ground fire. But the structural damage to Midway's defensive infrastructure was significant. By the time Tomonaga's formation turned back northwest toward the Kido Butai, the atoll had been hit hard. Sand Island was burning in several places. Eastern Island's runway was pocked with craters. The garrison's communications had been disrupted. Casualties among the defending Marines and other personnel were real and painful. And yet, crucially, the runway was still functional. Midway was hurt but alive. Even as Tomonaga's aircraft were making their attack runs, the Americans on Midway were hitting back. The garrison's strike aircraft, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-26 Marauder medium bombers, Old Navy Vindicator dive bombers, Marine Dauntless aircraft, and Navy TBF Avenger torpedo planes, launched successive attacks against the Japanese carrier force. These attacks were brave, persistent, and, in material terms, almost completely unsuccessful. The B-17s attacked from high altitude and achieved no hits on the maneuvering Japanese carriers, despite dropping hundreds of bombs across several separate raids. The torpedo aircraft made low-level runs directly into the combined wall of Japanese fighter cover and heavy anti-aircraft fire. The results were catastrophic for the attackers. Of the first wave of torpedo planes launched from Midway, only a fraction returned. Of those, most were so badly damaged as to be inoperable. None of the torpedo attacks achieved hits. This pattern, courage producing sacrifice without commensurate physical damage, would repeat itself across the morning of the 4th of June in a way that was simultaneously heartbreaking and, in a larger strategic sense, invaluable. Every American aircraft that pressed an attack against the Kido Butai was occupying the attention of Japanese combat air patrol fighters and anti-aircraft gunners. Every attack that Nagumo had to defend against was an attack that kept the Kido Butai maneuvering, its flight decks occupied with recovering and relaunching fighters, its command staff dealing with threats from multiple directions. The attrition of the American strike forces from Midway was severe. The disruption to Japanese operational rhythm was, though not obvious in the moment, cumulative. It was adding minutes and decisions to Nagumo's morning, and minutes and decisions were precisely what the Americans needed to accumulate. Tomonaga, having completed his attack on Midway, assessed the results from the air and reached a conclusion that would prove to be one of the most consequential judgments of the battle. The atoll had been hit, but not neutralized. The runway was still usable. Japanese ground forces could not land on Midway, while it remained capable of mounting air operations. A second strike was needed. He sent the message back to Nagumo. A second attack on Midway was required. This message arrived on Akagi's bridge at approximately 7 in the morning and placed Nagumo in the first of several decision points that would define his morning. He had a reserve strike force on his carrier decks, currently armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, weapons designed for use against ships. If he was going to launch a second attack on Midway, he needed to rearm those aircraft with land attack ordnance. That rearmament would take time, and it would require bringing the weapons up from the magazines below. Nagumo ordered the rearmament. This decision, reasonable on its face, given Tomonaga's assessment and the operational priority of securing Midway for the landing, would set in motion a sequence of events whose consequences were irreversible. The weapons crews on the carriers began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs from aircraft in the hangar decks and replacing them with general-purpose land attack bombs. The torpedoes and the heavier bombs, rather than being returned immediately to the magazines below, a slower but safer procedure, were stacked on the hangar decks beside the aircraft to facilitate rapid reloading. It was an operationally logical choice in a situation demanding speed. It was also, as the morning would demonstrate, a decision that turned each of those carrier hangar decks into something profoundly vulnerable. 8 minutes after Nagumo issued the rearmament order, at approximately 7:20 in the morning, a report arrived from one of his search aircraft. The reconnaissance floatplane from the cruiser Tone, the aircraft that had been launched late due to a catapult problem and had therefore been behind schedule all morning, reported sighting approximately 10 American ships to the north-northeast. The contact report was vague. No carrier was specifically identified. But the words surface ships, in the context of an approaching American force, meant one thing above all others to a carrier admiral: the possibility that enemy carriers were in range. Nagumo's rearmament order was still being executed. The first torpedoes were only beginning to come off the aircraft. His morning had just become dramatically more complicated. The next hour on Akagi's bridge was a study in escalating pressure. Nagumo sent back a query to the search plane: report the composition and types of ships. The answer, when it came, included the word that changed everything. The contact force included what appeared to be a carrier. The rearmament order was now a liability. Aircraft partially rearmed with land attack ordnance were not suited for a strike against a carrier. The decision to switch the armament back to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs meant stopping the land attack reloading, retrieving the anti-ship weapons from the hangar decks, and beginning the rearmament cycle, again in the opposite direction. It was a reversal that cost time the Japanese carrier force could not afford. The weapons piled on the hangar decks were moved again, and again the speed of the process left them exposed on the deck, rather than properly stowed. What was unfolding on those 4 Japanese carrier flight decks in the morning hours of the 4th of June, 1942, was the compounding of operational friction under pressure, a cascade of individually defensible decisions that collectively created a dangerous situation. The Kido Butai was managing simultaneous demands: recovering Tomonaga's returning strike force, which needed to land and be refueled and rearmed, launching fighters to intercept new American attacks from Midway, conducting the weapons rearmament reversal on the reserve strike force, and now tracking an American carrier to the northeast. Nagumo faced a commander's dilemma. He needed to get his carrier strike aircraft airborne as quickly as possible to hit the American carrier before it could launch against him. But to do so, he either had to launch them, partially armed and unsupported, or wait until his first strike's aircraft had been recovered, the rearmament completed, and a full strike properly constituted. He chose to wait for the full strike. It was the kind of decision that looks cautious or wrong only in retrospect. In the moment, with all the variables Nagumo was managing, it was the kind of decision that experienced commanders make. It was also the last mistake Nagumo's carriers would have the luxury of making. Chapter 8: The Torpedo Bombers. Sacrifice without glory. There are stories from the Battle of Midway that resist easy framing. They resist the language of triumph. They sit in the record of the battle as facts that are nearly unbearable to contemplate. Not because they speak to failure, but because they speak to what human beings can bring themselves to do when duty and circumstance point in the same terrible direction. The story of the American torpedo bomber squadrons on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, is one of those stories. It is a story of men who flew into conditions they knew were nearly unsurvivable, achieved no direct material result, and in doing so may have created the conditions for a victory they did not live to see. History is not always clean. Sometimes it is this. The carrier Bates torpedo bombers available to the American task forces were the Douglas TBD Devastator, an aircraft that had been at the leading edge of naval aviation technology when it was introduced in the mid-1930s, but had been substantially overtaken by subsequent developments. By 1942, the Devastator was slow, with a modest cruising speed that made it particularly vulnerable once it committed to its attack profile, a long, low, straight approach run at barely above sea level, constrained by the requirements of the torpedo's entry into the water. The pilot and crew could not weave or evade once the attack run began. They had to fly straight and level, directly at the target, through whatever defensive fire stood between them and their release point. The Zero fighters that protected the Kido Butai could fly roughly twice as fast. The equation was not a comfortable one, and every pilot who flew a Devastator on the 4th of June knew it. The 3 carrier torpedo squadrons, Torpedo 8 from the Hornet, Torpedo 6 from the Enterprise, and Torpedo 3 from the Yorktown, reached the Kido Butai in sequence across the mid-morning hours. Each squadron's story is distinct, but the broad shape of each engagement follows the same arc. The American torpedo aircraft approached from different angles and at different times, partly because of navigational uncertainty in finding the carriers, and partly because of the coordination challenges inherent in a multi-carrier strike against a target that was itself maneuvering. Fighter escorts that were supposed to cover the torpedo planes either failed to connect with them or were drawn away by other engagements. The Devastators went in without adequate fighter cover against a combat air patrol of Zeros that had been kept airborne and alert by the succession of attacks from Midway throughout the morning. Torpedo 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, found the Japanese carriers and attacked without hesitation or deviation. Waldron had disagreed with the group commander about the search heading before launch, had deviated from the assigned route based on his own judgment, and had found the Kido Butai when other squadrons were still searching. Every one of his 15 aircraft made their attack run. Not one survived to return to the Hornet. Of the men who flew in those aircraft, one survived. Ensign George Gay, who clung to a floating cushion after his aircraft was shot down and watched the rest of the battle unfold from the water. He was the only survivor of his entire squadron. 15 aircraft, 30 men, 0 hits on the Japanese carriers. The mathematics of that morning's work, on the surface, appear to offer nothing but loss. That surface reading is inadequate to the full truth of what happened. Torpedo 6 from the Enterprise arrived shortly after Torpedo 8, also without adequate fighter escort. The result was similar in the proportions of loss. The Zeros and the anti-aircraft fire tore through the attacking formation with devastating effect. Torpedo 3 from the Yorktown arrived next, this time accompanied by a fighter escort of Wildcat fighters. But the Zeros had weight of numbers and positioned themselves to intercept the slow-moving devastators before the Wildcats could maintain effective cover. The losses across all 3 torpedo squadrons were severe. The precise numbers vary slightly across different historical accounts, but the combined picture shows the majority of attacking aircraft shot down and none of the torpedo attacks achieving hits. The Japanese carriers, under Nagumo's command, maneuvered at high speed, turning toward the approaching torpedoes to comb through them and present the narrowest possible target profile. The tactics worked, the torpedoes missed, and yet, in the tactical calculus of that morning, the torpedo attacks had accomplished something that their lost crews could not observe. The Zeros defending the Kido Butai had been pulled down from altitude. Combat air patrol fighters, in engaging the low-level torpedo planes, had descended toward the ocean's surface, exactly where the slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers were flying. The Zeros were fast and agile, but they burned fuel at high rates, at full throttle, and the repeated interventions against the succession of American attacks had occupied them continuously. Some had landed back on the carriers to refuel. The ones still airborne were, by the time the torpedo attacks were concluding, largely positioned at low altitude, not high altitude. The Kido Butai had been looking down at the surface of the ocean for the better part of an hour. It had not been looking up, and from above, from altitude, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers of Enterprise and Yorktown were already in their attack dives. The pilots of the torpedo squadrons, who did not return that morning, left behind letters, personal effects, and in some cases, the kind of operational records that tell us something about the interior experience of flying that mission. What emerges from those records is not a picture of men who did not understand their situation. It is a picture of men who understood it completely and went anyway. The distinction matters enormously. Recklessness is one thing. Deliberate acceptance of terrible risk in service of a larger purpose is something altogether different and deserves to be recognized as such. These men knew the Devastator's limitations. They knew the Zero's capabilities. They knew that flying a long, straight, low approach run against carriers, ringed with fighters, was an enterprise in which the likelihood of survival was poor. They went because the mission required them to go, because the carriers below them had to be struck, and because someone had to fly the available aircraft. They did not achieve their immediate tactical objective. They may have made everything else possible. The Japanese officers watching from the bridges and from the carriers' anti-aircraft positions, as the torpedo attacks unfolded, felt the relief of men who have survived a serious test. The Kido Butai had been under attack almost continuously since dawn, from shore-based aircraft, from the American carrier torpedo planes, and had taken no significant damage. The combat air patrol had performed exactly as required. The carriers were intact, armed, and preparing to launch their decisive strike against the American carrier force. Nagumo's decision to wait for a full, properly constituted strike had been rewarded, or so it appeared. The reserve strike force was nearly ready. The aircraft were armed, fueled, staged on the hangar decks. The Japanese morning had been expensive in fuel and fighter resources, but the fleet was operational, and the enemy had been beaten off with heavy losses. There was no reason, from the bridge of the Akagi, at approximately 10:20 in the morning, to believe the next few minutes would be anything other than the prelude to a decisive Japanese counterstrike. The absence of high-altitude threat in the Kido Butai's defensive consciousness was now nearly complete. The combat air patrol fighters were low. The lookouts were focused on the water. The hangar decks of all four carriers were crowded with armed, fueled aircraft, and, in some cases, with weapons that had been staged on the deck, rather than returned to the magazines. The carriers were conducting the busiest phase of carrier operations, the transition from receiving returned aircraft to launching a new strike. A phase that requires every deck crew, every weapons crew, every engineer and pilot and officer to be doing something specific and necessary. The ships were at their most capable and, in a particular operational sense, at their most vulnerable simultaneously. Into that moment, descending from clear sky at high altitude, came the dauntless dive bombers. They had been searching for over an hour. They had nearly run out of time and fuel. And then, by a combination of dead reckoning, judgment, and what at least one account describes simply as fortune, they found the Kido Butai. Spread across the ocean below them, its fighters down low, its decks crowded, its attention directed everywhere except upward. What followed happened fast. Faster than any narrative can properly convey. The world that the Japanese carrier commanders had inhabited for the past 6 months. The world in which the Kido Butai was the dominant force in the Pacific, undefeated and seemingly undefeatable, was about to end. And it was going to end not in the hours-long slugging match that naval strategists had been expecting since the 1920s, but in minutes. 5 minutes, by some accounts. The dive bombers were already in their dives. The lookouts were already screaming warnings. The anti-aircraft guns were swinging upward behind the curve. Time had run out for 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, and they did not yet know it. Chapter 9, 5 minutes that broke an empire. The dive bomber attack, there is a tendency, in recounting the decisive moment of the Battle of Midway, to reach for superlatives, to describe it as miraculous, unprecedented, beyond the range of probability. The temptation is understandable. What happened between approximately 10:20 and 10:30 in the morning of the 4th of June 1942 was by any objective measure extraordinary. 3 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were mortally stricken within roughly 5 minutes of each other. The 4-carrier Kido Butai, the force that had defined Japanese naval power for 6 months, was reduced to a single operational carrier in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee. But to call it a miracle is to do a disservice to the planning, the intelligence work, the sacrificed torpedo crews, and the navigational judgment that made it possible. It was not luck dressed up as planning. It was planning that had compressed an otherwise improbable outcome into achievable range, and then execution that met the moment. The dive bomber groups that arrived over the Kido Butai at approximately 10:20 in the morning came from 2 separate carriers, following 2 separate approach routes, and arrived in a convergence that was partly coordinated and partly the result of independent decisions made by individual pilots and squadron leaders. Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, had spent over an hour searching for the Japanese carriers after they failed to appear where the initial plot suggested they would be. Fuel was becoming critical. McCluskey made a decision to continue the search on a new heading based on his own assessment of where the Japanese fleet was likely to have gone. That decision, made by one man alone in a cockpit over the empty Pacific, eventually produced the sighting of a Japanese destroyer's wake. A thin white line on the blue surface below, pointing northwest toward the Kido Butai. McCluskey followed it. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading Yorktown's Bombing 3, had taken a slightly different approach route and arrived at the target area independently, in a technical misfortune that became operationally irrelevant. Leslie and several of his pilots had accidentally armed their bomb releases, prematurely jettisoning their bombs before they reached the target. They pressed the attack anyway, making dummy runs to distract the Japanese gunners and fighters, while the aircraft that still had bombs made their deliveries. This is not a detail that appears in any summary of the battle's decisive outcome. It is the kind of detail that matters precisely because it speaks to what men do when things go wrong and the mission still has to be done. The attack itself, in the terms that battle records preserve, was devastating beyond any reasonable expectation. McCluskey's dive bombers split their attack between Akagi and Kaga. Bombing 3 concentrated on Soryu. The aircraft screamed down from altitude through the anti-aircraft fire that the Japanese gunners were only now bringing to bear. Too late to break up the attack, capable only of inflicting losses on aircraft that had already committed to their dives. On Akagi, at least one bomb struck the flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck below. There, among the fueled aircraft and the ordnance that had been staged, rather than properly stowed, the explosion found everything it needed to become catastrophic. Fires reached the ammunition. The secondary explosions that followed were beyond the capacity of any damage control system to contain. Kaga took multiple hits. The explosions and fires on her hangar deck followed the same terrible logic. Fueled aircraft, staged ordnance, and the interlocking explosions that each detonation triggered in the material stored around it. Soryu, hit by 3 bombs from Yorktown's dive bombers, was similarly overtaken within minutes by fires that the crew could not control. The 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, were all effectively finished as fighting units within minutes of the first bomb hitting. They would burn for hours. Their crews would fight the fires with everything available. Some would survive until the following day before finally sinking. But they were done as carriers. Their aircraft, many of which had been armed and fueled and ready to launch the decisive Japanese counterstrike, were consumed in the fires that the staged ordnance made inevitable. Japan had committed 6 months of Pacific dominance to these ships. They were going simultaneously. On the bridges of the stricken carriers, the speed of what was happening defied immediate comprehension. Akagi's senior officers attempted to assess whether the ship could be saved. Damage control parties fought fires in conditions that became progressively less survivable as the secondary explosions propagated through the hangar. The decision to transfer Nagumo's flag from the burning Akagi to the cruiser Nagara required Nagumo and his staff to physically climb down ropes from the carrier's bridge because the fires below had cut off the normal means of descent. This moment, the commander of the most powerful carrier force in the Pacific, climbing down a rope from his burning flagship in his 60s, captures something essential about how completely and quickly the morning had reversed itself. Nagumo had woken that morning in command of an operation he expected to conclude in Japanese victory. He was now a flag officer without a flagship, watching 3 of his 4 carriers burn. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived the initial attack. She had been positioned somewhat separately from the other 3. The geographical dispersion, that was a standard feature of Japanese carrier. Operations meant that she was far enough from the dive bomber attacks to escape the first strike. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, was arguably the most aggressive and tactically capable of the Japanese carrier admirals present. He did not waste time on assessment. He recognized immediately that the only viable response was to launch everything Hiryu had at the American carriers before she too was found, and struck. He ordered an immediate strike, not waiting to constitute a properly balanced air group. Speed was the only asset Hiryu still possessed, and he used it. Within minutes of the dive bomber attack on the other 3 carriers, Hiryu was turning into the wind and launching her aircraft. The battle was not over. It had just changed shape entirely. The American strike groups, their ordnance expended, were already turning back toward their carriers, burning fuel they could barely spare. Some of them with battle damage, some with wounded crewmen, all of them having just done something that no one in the history of carrier aviation had done before. In quite this way. The men who had made their dives and released their bombs and pulled out and fled knew that they had hit the carriers. The columns of smoke rising from the Kido Butai were visible for many kilometers. What they could not know, pulling away at low altitude and looking back at the smoke, was whether their hits had been enough, or how many carriers were still functional, or what was going to happen in the hours ahead. They knew they had accomplished something significant. The full dimensions of what they had accomplished would only become clear later. Much later, for some of them. For now, they had fuel to manage and a carrier deck to find. The reaction in the American task forces, when reports began coming in from returning pilots, was carefully measured against the uncertainty that still existed. One Japanese carrier was known to be still operational, Hiryu, and Hiryu was already responding. Fletcher and Spruance both knew that the situation had changed dramatically in their favor, but the battle was not over, and overconfidence was its own danger. Spruance was, by temperament, not given to premature celebration. He was already thinking about the next decision, where the strike against Hiryu should come from, when it should be launched, and how to manage the fuel and ordnance state of his remaining aircraft. The man who had never commanded a carrier force in combat before that morning was performing, in the most pressurized imaginable context, with a quality of judgment that his opponents had simply not expected. The morning had been American. The afternoon was still unwritten. What the 5 minutes over the Kido Butai represented was not merely a tactical success of extraordinary proportions. It was the operational consequence of every decision made in the 6 months since Pearl Harbor. The intelligence work at Station HYPO, the repair of the Yorktown, Nimitz's decision to trust his codebreakers, Spruance's decision about strike timing, McCluskey's decision to continue searching when fuel was critically low, the torpedo squadron's sacrifice that pulled the Zeros down to altitude. Every one of those decisions, made in sequence by different people, in different places, under different pressures, had contributed to the moment when the dive bombers arrived over an undefended Kido Butai and changed the Pacific War. This is what makes Midway extraordinary. Not the drama of the moment itself, but the chain of choices, most of them invisible in the outcome's brilliance, that made the moment possible. No single person won the Battle of Midway. A system, imperfect, improvised, sometimes agonizing in its failures, produced the outcome. The dive bombers were the last link in a chain that stretched back to December of 1941. Chapter 10, Hiryu Strikes Back, The Ghost Ship and the Afternoon Battle. The story of the Battle of Midway does not end at 10:30 in the morning of the 4th of June, 1942. The narrative that stops at the sinking of 3 Japanese carriers, the clean, triumphant narrative, is real, but it is incomplete. What followed the dive bomber attack was a second battle within the battle. Smaller in scale, more intimate in its cruelties, and in some ways more complex in what it demands of those who try to understand it. The story of the afternoon of the 4th of June is the story of Hiryu, and of the USS Yorktown, and of the strange way that a ship the Japanese had already written off as sunk came back to haunt them, and the stranger, more painful way that she was eventually lost. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi launched Hiryu's first strike without waiting for a full formation. He sent 18 Val dive bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, toward the American carrier force. The Japanese pilots had limited intelligence about exactly where the American carriers were. Their search information was incomplete and partially out of date. What they found first was the USS Yorktown, positioned somewhat forward of the other 2 American carriers. Yorktown was the ship that Japanese intelligence had assessed as still under repair at Pearl Harbor. The ship Nagumo's planners had written out of their order of battle. She was here, she was operational, and she was about to demonstrate the quality of the repair work that 1,400 men had performed in 72 hours at Pearl Harbor Naval shipyard. Kobayashi's 18 dive bombers attacked Yorktown through anti-aircraft fire and Wildcat fighter interception that was, in marked contrast to the morning's torpedo attacks, relatively effective. Yorktown's combat air patrol and her anti-aircraft batteries were fully alert and ready. The attacking force was cut down significantly during the approach. But 3 bombs found their mark. They struck the carrier's flight deck and penetrated into the ship's interior spaces. Fires started. The ship's speed dropped. The radar system was knocked out temporarily. Damage to the uptakes from the boiler rooms caused the carrier to lose propulsion. For a short time, Yorktown lay dead in the water, her flight deck damaged, her internal spaces fighting fires that looked, from the outside, entirely consistent with a mortally stricken ship. Japanese scout aircraft, observing from a distance, reported back to Yamaguchi 1 American carrier had been left burning and stopped. What happened next aboard the Yorktown is the episode that gave the ship her reputation. The damage control lessons learned from the loss of USS Lexington at the Coral Sea had been specifically incorporated into Yorktown's procedures and equipment. Her crew went to work with a thoroughness and efficiencies that reflected months of studying what had gone wrong on Lexington and what could be done differently. Fires were brought under control. The carbon dioxide purging system for the aviation fuel lines. A direct lesson from the Lexington's loss prevented the kind of fuel-fed conflagration that had doomed the earlier carrier. Engineers worked on the boilers. The carbon dioxide system isolated the bunker fuel that could have turned a serious fire into an uncontrollable one. The flight deck damage was assessed, patched sufficiently for emergency operations, and within roughly an hour of taking 3 bomb hits, Yorktown was making approximately 20 knots and had resumed flight operations. Her crew had not merely repaired their ship under fire, they had performed a feat of damage control that Japanese intelligence analysts would find literally unbelievable. Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga led Hiryu's second strike. 10 torpedo planes and 6 Zero escorts toward the American carriers. His aircraft were already low on fuel from the morning attack on Midway. He knew he likely did not have enough fuel for a full round trip. He went anyway, because Yamaguchi needed every aircraft available, and Tomonaga was not the kind of officer who stayed behind when his unit was committed. When his force found what appeared to be a fully operational American carrier, steaming at high speed and launching aircraft, he radioed back that he had found a second American carrier, a fresh one, undamaged, different from the carrier that Kobayashi had just left burning. This was the Yorktown, recovered beyond anything that Japanese engineering experience suggested was possible, looking so operational that the aviator who had seen the damage done to her just 90 minutes earlier could not recognize her as the same ship. This case of mistaken identity was not a small error. It was strategically significant. Yamaguchi believed, based on Tomonaga's report, that he had now struck 2 different American carriers, that 2 of the 3 American carriers had been neutralized. This belief influenced his subsequent decisions and his reports up the chain of command. Yamamoto, hundreds of kilometers away on Yamato, was receiving damage reports from the battle, filtered through the confusion of the engagement, and now inflated by a misidentification that made the Japanese position appear less catastrophic than it actually was. The perception that 2 American carriers had been struck, rather than the same carrier twice, became embedded in Japanese reporting at a moment when accurate damage assessment was critical to every subsequent decision. Tomonaga's torpedo attack hit Yorktown with 2 torpedoes on the port side. The explosions ruptured the ship's machinery spaces, caused flooding that the damage control teams could not fully manage, and gave the carrier a list, a tilt to one side, that threatened to capsize her if the flooding was not controlled. The damage was more serious than the bomb hits had been. The list increased as flooding continued. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, commanding the Yorktown, faced one of the hardest decisions a captain can face: whether to stay aboard a ship that is listing and flooding, fighting to save her, or to abandon ship to preserve the crew for future service. He ordered abandonment. The crew went into the water. Yorktown was left riding low in the ocean, listing badly, apparently finished. 2 Japanese strikes had now left her in far more serious condition than 3 bombs alone had produced. Japanese aircraft reported her sinking. Their intelligence had written her off twice in one day, just as it had written her off once before after the Coral Sea. The Yorktown was, by any reasonable accounting, done. Except she wasn't yet. Not quite. Destroyers came alongside and took off survivors. A salvage team later reboarded the carrier and began trying to save her, working to correct her list by counterflooding, beginning to assess whether she could be towed back to Pearl Harbor for the repairs that were now genuinely beyond emergency patching. For a time, several hours of careful, difficult work in waters where enemy submarines were known to operate. It seemed as though the Yorktown might survive even this. The ship that had been written off 3 times was still afloat, listing but intact, her salvage crew working through the night. The effort was genuine, the determination was real. And for a while it appeared that the Yorktown's remarkable capacity to absorb punishment and remain above water might extend even to this most serious damage. For a while. The full end of that story belongs to the following day, but the arc of it, the carrier that kept fighting and kept surviving, beyond every expectation, is one of the genuine human narratives of the battle. Meanwhile, the dive bombers of Enterprise had found Hiryu. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led the attack. 24 SBD Dauntlesses descended on the last functional Japanese carrier of the Kido Butai in late afternoon. 4 bombs struck Hiryu's flight deck. The fires that followed were uncontrollable. Yamaguchi, who had driven his ship and his air crews with remorseless energy throughout the day, recognized that Hiryu was beyond saving. His response, when he understood this, was to remain aboard his burning carrier to the end. A decision that speaks to the particular weight that command carries when the outcome has been defeat. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi and Captain Tomeo Kaku stayed with the Hiryu as she burned through the night and sank in the early morning of the 5th of June. By dawn of that day, all 4 carriers of the Kido Butai were either sunk or sinking. Japan's 6-month domination of the Pacific had ended in less than 24 hours of combat. The afternoon of the 4th of June left both sides assessing losses in circumstances of exhaustion and incomplete information. The Americans had struck a blow beyond anything they had dared to expect. When the battle began, they had lost the Yorktown to damage she could not survive, and they had paid an enormous price in aircraft and aircrew throughout the day's fighting. But the arithmetic of the exchange was so lopsided in American favor that no honest accounting could obscure what had happened. 4 Japanese fleet carriers against 1 American fleet carrier, and the American carrier was still technically afloat. The Pacific War had changed direction permanently between dawn and dusk on a single day over an atoll barely large enough to hold a runway and a fuel dump. The size of the place bore no relationship to the size of what had happened there. Chapter 11. The Admirals. Decision-making under pressure. The Battle of Midway was, among many other things, a laboratory of command under extreme pressure, a test of whether the decisions made by flag officers in real time, with incomplete information and cascading operational complexity, would prove adequate to the demands of the situation. 4 admirals shaped the battle's outcome. Nimitz from Pearl Harbor, Fletcher and Spruance from their carrier flagships, and Nagumo from his burning and then abandoned flagship. Their decisions, their hesitations, their moments of clarity, and their moments of misjudgment are woven through every phase of the engagement in ways that military historians have been analyzing for decades. The battle did not happen to these men. These men made the battle. Admiral Chester Nimitz never saw the battle directly. He commanded it from Pearl Harbor, 1,400 kilometers from the action. Through a combination of pre-battle planning, intelligence preparation, and the delegation of tactical command to the admirals he had placed in the combat zone. This is, in one sense, the oldest problem of high command. How do you shape an engagement you cannot personally observe? Nimitz's answer was to trust his intelligence, trust his people, and give his task force commanders maximum latitude within a clearly stated intent. He had told Fletcher and Spruance what the strategic objective was: inflict maximum damage on the Japanese carrier force, and had given them the intelligence picture that made intelligent decision-making possible. What he had not done, and deliberately did not do, was attempt to micromanage from a great distance. That restraint, the willingness to let his commanders command, was itself a form of decision-making. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance's performance at Midway is, by the consensus of historical analysis, one of the finest examples of improvised carrier command in the war. He had never commanded a carrier force in combat before the 4th of June. He had spent the voyage from Pearl Harbor studying carrier doctrine with the focused intensity of a man who understands he is about to be examined on material he has not yet fully mastered. His two most important decisions of the battle were made in sequence during the morning of the 4th. First, when to launch his strike against the Japanese carriers, and second, after the dive bomber attack's success, whether to press a night pursuit of the remaining Japanese surface forces or withdraw eastward. The first decision, launching early, accepting the risk that his aircraft might have to ditch in the ocean if their fuel ran out on the return, reflected an accurate assessment of the opportunity presented. The second decision, withdrawing east rather than pursuing, reflected an equally accurate assessment of the risks of a night engagement against Japanese surface forces that outnumbered him substantially. Both decisions were correct. Neither was obvious in advance. Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher's role at Midway has been the subject of more critical historical reassessment than Spruance's. Fletcher commanded overall American forces in the battle, flying his flag from the Yorktown. His management of the engagement during the morning hours was methodical. He held back a portion of his air group initially, waiting for better intelligence on the Japanese disposition before committing everything. When the Yorktown was hit and damaged, Fletcher transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria and allowed Spruance to effectively assume operational leadership of the engagement. The question of whether Fletcher's caution in the opening phase cost opportunities or simply reflected sound professional judgment in conditions of uncertainty is one that historians continue to debate. What is clear is that the overall American command structure functioned well enough to produce the result required, which in the circumstances was no small thing. Nagumo's command failures at Midway are more clearly defined in the record, but they deserve to be assessed with the context they require rather than the luxury of hindsight. The weapons rearmament decision, switching the reserve strike force from anti-ship to land attack weapons and then back again, was not the product of incompetence. It was the product of genuine ambiguity. Was the next priority Midway or the American ships? Nagumo did not have the intelligence picture that would have told him with certainty that American carriers were in the operational area. He had a partial, delayed, and imprecise contact report from a search aircraft that had launched late. His decision to wait for a fully constituted strike before launching against the American carrier force was the cautious professional choice, not the reckless one. The consequence of that caution was catastrophic, but the caution itself was not irrational. This distinction matters because it is honest, and history requires honesty, even when the honest account is less dramatic than the convenient one. The communications architecture of the Japanese command structure at Midway was, however, a genuine systemic failure that amplified every individual error. Yamamoto, sailing with the main body more than 600 kilometers behind the action, was operating under radio silence that his own operational security requirements had imposed. He could not intervene as the battle developed. The contact report from Nagumo's search aircraft was delayed. Damage reports travelled up the chain slowly and inaccurately. Yamaguchi's reports about striking 2 American carriers were accepted without the skepticism they deserved, partly because the communication system made verification impossible. The command hierarchy that Japan had built for the Midway operation was architecturally unsuited to the kind of real-time crisis management that the 4th of June required. The fragmentation of the fleet into 10 separate formations, widely separated, compounded this problem. Japanese command and control at Midway was, in the crucial hours of the battle, effectively paralyzed by its own complexity. Yamamoto's response, when the full dimensions of the disaster became clear, was to consider, briefly, whether to press a night surface engagement, to bring the battleships and cruisers forward, close with the American fleet in darkness, and attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of the operation. The idea had logic. Japanese surface forces substantially outnumbered the American task forces, and Japanese naval doctrine had for years emphasized night combat as a domain of Japanese tactical superiority. Yamamoto issued preliminary orders for a night engagement. But the intelligence picture, the uncertainty about American carrier strength, the distance that separated Japanese surface forces from the operational area, the fuel states of various formations, argued against it. Yamamoto eventually cancelled the order and turned his forces back toward Japan. It was, in the circumstances, the correct decision. A night surface engagement against an opponent who might have more carriers operational than Japanese intelligence indicated was a risk the situation no longer justified. The moment had passed. The decision to withdraw was the last command decision of the Battle of Midway, and it was a rational one. Rational decisions made in catastrophic circumstances are their own kind of courage. Admiral Spruance, having achieved one of the most decisive carrier victories in naval history, displayed in the hours after the dive bomber attack the same quality of measured judgment that had characterized his morning decisions. He did not pursue aggressively into the night. He did not send his strike groups on additional attacks against targets he could not accurately locate and whose strength he could not fully assess. He managed his fuel and ammunition states carefully. He kept his carriers between the Japanese force and Hawaii. In Nimitz's original directive, the protection of Midway and the Hawaiian Islands was the strategic priority. Spruance understood that the victory already achieved could be undone if he drove his ships into an engagement on unfavorable terms, chasing targets he could not see. The aggressive option was available to him, and he declined it. Some historians have criticized this restraint, arguing that a more aggressive pursuit might have destroyed additional Japanese surface units. Others, the majority, conclude that Spruance's caution preserved the victory rather than diminishing it. The debate itself speaks to the difficulty of command. Even the right decisions generate argument. The role of the individual aviators, the pilots and aircrew who flew the actual missions, deserves recognition alongside the admirals who directed them, because at Midway, more than in most battles, the conduct of individual aircrew shaped the outcome directly. McCluskey's decision to extend his search. The torpedo squadron pilots who pressed attacks they understood would likely kill them. The dive bomber pilots who held their nerve in their dives through anti-aircraft fire. The fighter pilots who traded their lives for additional minutes over Midway. Each of these was a command decision made at the lowest level by a single person in a cockpit with no time for consultation and no certainty about the outcome. The flag officers set the conditions. The aircrew executed them with a quality of commitment that makes any assessment of the battle that focuses solely on the admirals deeply incomplete. The Battle of Midway demonstrated, as clearly as any engagement in modern naval history, that the quality of command under pressure cannot be assessed in advance from service records and peacetime reputation. Halsey, the man who would have led Task Force 16, was in a hospital bed. Spruance, the man who replaced him, had never commanded carriers in combat. Rochefort, the man whose intelligence made the ambush possible, was not a combat officer at all. The battle's outcome was shaped by people performing functions they had not previously performed at that scale in circumstances that no previous experience had fully prepared them for, making decisions that could not be unmade once taken. That is not a comfortable truth for military institutions that prefer to believe preparedness is everything. At Midway, preparedness helped. Adaptability, judgment under pressure, and the willingness to trust imperfect information when action was required. These proved to be equally decisive. Chapter 12, Aftermath and Reckoning. What Midway cost and what it changed. The guns fell silent over the Central Pacific on the 7th of June, 1942. The precise moment of ending did not announce itself with the same drama as the beginning. Battles rarely end cleanly, and Midway's conclusion was marked by Japanese withdrawal, American consolidation, and the continuing private emergencies of damaged ships and lost aircraft scattered across an enormous ocean. But by the 7th of June, the essential outcome was established beyond doubt or revision. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with 1 heavy cruiser, approximately 248 aircraft, and the experienced pilots and aircrew who had flown them. The United States had lost the carrier, Yorktown, a destroyer, approximately 145 aircraft, and the men who flew and crewed them. The exchange rate was stark, and its strategic implications were immediately apparent to anyone who understood the Pacific War's arithmetic. The USS Yorktown's end came on the 7th of June, 2 days after she had been torpedoed during the battle. The salvage effort that had begun after Captain Buckmaster ordered abandonment had made genuine progress. Counterflooding had partially corrected her list. A tow was being organized. For a time, the ship that had survived the Coral Sea and survived 2 separate Japanese attacks on the 4th of June appeared to have survived again. Then, a Japanese submarine, the I-168, which had been directed to Midway to bombard the atoll's facilities, found the damaged carrier and her escort. 2 torpedoes struck the Yorktown. The destroyer USS Hammond, alongside the carrier assisting with salvage, was also hit and sank almost immediately. The Yorktown, her damage now beyond any further salvation, sank the following morning. She went down carrying the tools and equipment of the salvage crew that had been working to save her. One final indignity for a ship that had refused to die easily. The cost in human terms is not reducible to numbers, but the numbers provide a framework. The United States lost approximately 307 men killed in the battle. In the aircraft, in the ships, in the water. Japan's losses were substantially higher, though precise figures have been debated by historians for decades, with estimates for aircrew alone running to several hundred. The pilots and aircrew of the Kido Butai, who were lost at Midway, veterans of Pearl Harbor, of the Indian Ocean raids, of months of Pacific combat, represented an irreplaceable accumulation of trained experience. Japan's pilot training program, unlike its American counterpart, had not been designed with mass wartime production in mind. The instructors and senior pilots whose deaths at Midway drained the training system of its most experienced personnel were a loss that propagated forward through the entire subsequent history of Japanese carrier aviation in every engagement that followed. The news management around the Battle of Midway revealed the starkly different institutional characters of the 2 nations involved. In the United States, the press reported a significant victory, though the full details of the intelligence achievement at Station HYPO were tightly suppressed and would remain so for years to protect the cryptanalytic capability that had made it possible. One Chicago newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, published a story shortly after the battle that strongly implied the United States had advanced knowledge of Japanese plans. A serious security breach that prompted a government investigation and intense concern about whether Japan would recognize that its codes had been compromised. Japan, for its part, suppressed news of the defeat entirely. The sailors and officers who survived the battle returned to Japan in secrecy, quarantined from the general population, their ships arriving at night, their accounts subject to strict censorship. The Japanese public was not told that 4 carriers had been lost at Midway. They were told, instead, of the operations in the Aleutians, where Japanese forces had successfully occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska, and allowed to infer a general picture of continuing Japanese success. The strategic consequences of Midway began to materialize almost immediately. Japan had entered the battle with the intention of extending its Pacific perimeter to include Midway, from which future operations against Hawaii could be contemplated, and of destroying the American carrier fleet to prevent any effective response. Both objectives had been not merely failed but reversed. The American carrier fleet survived, and the Japanese carrier force had been decimated. The offensive momentum that Japan had maintained since Pearl Harbor, the capacity to choose when and where to strike, to keep the Americans reacting rather than acting, was fundamentally altered. Japan was not suddenly on the defensive in every theater, and its forces retained formidable capabilities. But the ability to mount large-scale offensive carrier operations, the capability that had made the preceding 6 months of expansion possible, was gone, and it was gone in a way that the attrition of experienced aircrew made almost impossible to restore on any near-term timeline. For the United States, Midway represented something beyond the tactical balance sheet. It represented proof, operational, undeniable proof, that American forces could defeat a Japanese carrier fleet in direct engagement. For a navy that had spent 6 months absorbing blows and maintaining a defensive posture while rebuilding, that demonstration was of incalculable value. It validated the intelligence investment. It validated the decision to trust Rochefort over Washington's institutional skepticism. It validated Nimitz's judgment in concentrating his outnumbered forces rather than dispersing them defensively. And it validated the training and the commitment of the aircrew who had executed the operation, including the torpedo squadron pilots whose sacrifice had contributed to the conditions for the dive bomber's success. The validation was not merely moral. It fed directly into operational planning for the next phase of the Pacific War, which would shift from defensive to offensive in the months following Midway. The Aleutian Islands operation, the diversionary attack that Japan had launched simultaneously with Midway, intended to draw American attention northward, resulted in Japanese forces occupying the islands of Attu and Kiska. This was the only tangible territorial acquisition Japan achieved from the entire Midway operation, and it was achieved in a theater that the main operation had not been designed to conquer. The occupation of 2 remote, fog-bound Alaskan islands was an awkward trophy for a fleet that had set out to destroy the American Pacific carrier force and secure the Central Pacific. The contrast between the Aleutian operations' modest success and the Midway operations' comprehensive failure underlines how completely the outcome had inverted Japanese expectations. They had planned to win everything and hold it with a neutralized American fleet. They had instead lost 4 carriers, failed to take their primary objective, and left the American carrier force fully capable of future offensive operations. The battle's impact on Japanese naval strategy was transformative, though the full adjustment in Japanese plans took months to develop. Yamamoto remained in command of the combined fleet and continued to seek the decisive surface engagement that Japanese doctrine had always identified as the path to Pacific victory. But the instrument of decisive action, the carrier fleet, had been stripped of half its operational capability at a stroke. Japanese planners were forced to reconsider the Midway failure in terms they were institutionally reluctant to fully acknowledge. The post-battle analysis within the Imperial Navy produced recommendations for improvements to combat, air patrol procedures, damage control practices, and weapons handling protocols on carrier decks. These were the right lessons to draw. They were also, in the case of the weapons handling protocols, lessons that had been available for drawing before Midway. The same vulnerability that destroyed the Kido Butai had existed before the 4th of June and had not been adequately addressed. The cost of that institutional failure was paid in 4 carriers and the pilots who burned with them. The men who survived Midway, American and Japanese alike, carried the experience in different ways for the rest of their lives. Some wrote about it, some refused to. Some found their public roles in the battle's legacy were larger than their private sense of what they had actually contributed, and some found the opposite, that what they had done was larger than any public account had captured. Joseph Rochefort was transferred away from Station HYPO within months of the battle, denied the formal recognition his contribution warranted, and spent years watching others receive credit for work his team had performed. He lived long enough to see some of that record corrected and to receive the Distinguished Service Medal, posthumously, awarded by President Ronald Reagan, decades after the battle whose outcome he had made possible. The delay between the deed and the recognition is one of those facts about the Battle of Midway that does not fit easily into a celebration. What Midway changed, ultimately, was not just the Pacific War's immediate trajectory. It changed the possible future of the war. Before the 4th of June, 1942, a Japanese victory in the Pacific, not a total victory, but a negotiated peace that left Japan in possession of the empire it had assembled, was a genuine strategic possibility. American industrial power would eventually overwhelm Japanese production, but the timeline was long, and the cost of fighting to conclusion might produce political pressures for settlement that could not be resisted indefinitely. Midway closed that possibility, not by ending the war. The war had more than 3 years still to run, but by demonstrating that American carrier forces could match and defeat the Kido Butai, and by stripping Japan of the carrier capability needed to force a favorable peace before American production made the outcome inevitable. The battle was not the end of the Pacific War. It was the beginning of the end, the moment when the trajectory of the conflict became, in the long view, irreversible. 4 carriers burning in the Central Pacific, and the world had changed. Chapter 13. The Tide Turns, Guadalcanal, and the South Pacific Crucible. The Battle of Midway did not end the Pacific War. It did not even end the offensive phase of Japanese operations. What it did, quietly, structurally, in ways that would take months to become fully visible, was remove the precondition for Japanese success. The Kido Butai had been the instrument by which Japan forced the pace of events in the Pacific. Without it, Japan could still fight, still resist, still inflict painful losses on American forces. But the ability to choose the time and place of the next decisive engagement, the strategic initiative that Pearl Harbor had purchased and 6 months of expansion had exercised, was gone. The United States would now begin the long, costly, grinding process of taking it back. That process began with uncomfortable speed, less than 2 months after Midway, on an island most Americans had never heard of, and most military planners had barely considered. Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands chain, runs southeast from the main Japanese base at Rabaul in an archipelago of jungle-covered islands that, in the summer of 1942, represented the southern edge of Japan's defensive perimeter. In June and early July of that year, Japanese forces began constructing an airfield on the island of Guadalcanal, a move that American planners recognized immediately as a strategic threat. An operational airfield on Guadalcanal would give Japan the ability to project air power over the supply routes between the United States and Australia, potentially cutting the logistical lifeline that sustained Allied forces in the South Pacific. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, pressed for an immediate countermove. The planning was rushed. The resources were scarce. The operation that resulted, codenamed Watchtower, nicknamed Operation Shoestring by the Marines who executed it, was launched on the 7th of August 1942, just 2 months after Midway. It would last 6 months and cost both sides far more than anyone anticipated when it began. The 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal and the nearby island of Tulagi on the 7th of August, 1942, achieving tactical surprise against Japanese forces that had not expected an American offensive at this stage of the war. The airfield under construction was seized on the first day and rapidly completed by American engineers, who renamed it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had been killed leading a dive bomber attack during the Battle of Midway. The naming was deliberate and meaningful. The airfield that would become the center of the Guadalcanal campaign was named for a man whose sacrifice at Midway exemplified the quality of commitment that the Pacific War demanded. Henderson Field would be bombed, shelled from the sea, and repeatedly attacked over the following months, and it would remain in American hands throughout. Its retention became the defining strategic objective of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The naval dimension of the Guadalcanal campaign quickly became as consequential as the land fighting. Japan responded to the American landing with immediate force, dispatching surface ships, aircraft, and eventually additional ground troops to retake the island. The waters around Guadalcanal, the strait between the island and the neighboring island of Florida, which American sailors would come to call Iron Bottom Sound, after the number of ships that sank there, became the scene of repeated, intense naval engagements across 6 months of fighting. Both sides lost ships in numbers that made the entire Guadalcanal campaign a sustained test of industrial and organizational capacity. The Battle of Savo Island, fought just days after the initial landing, was a sharp Japanese tactical victory that sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers in a night surface engagement. The loss was serious, and it exposed the limits of American night combat capability at this stage of the war. But the landing had succeeded, and Henderson Field was in American hands. The tactical setback at Savo Island did not undo the strategic success of the landing. The carrier battles that accompanied the Guadalcanal campaign demonstrated both the continuing danger posed by Japan's remaining carrier forces and the growing capability of the American carrier fleet. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August of 1942 and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in late October saw both sides inflicting and absorbing carrier aircraft losses in engagements that were costly and tactically complex. At Santa Cruz, Japan achieved a tactical victory, sinking the carrier USS Hornet and damaging the USS Enterprise, but at the cost of aircraft losses, particularly among experienced aircrew. That further accelerated the depletion of the Japanese carrier air groups. The pattern that Midway had established was repeating itself. Japan could win engagements in the South Pacific, but the attrition of experienced aviators was a debt being paid against a balance that could not be replenished at the same rate it was being drawn down. Meanwhile, American training programs were producing replacement pilots at a rate that Japanese planners had not modeled into their strategic calculations. The ground fighting on Guadalcanal developed its own rhythms of intensity and exhaustion. Japanese forces, committed to retaking Henderson Field, launched repeated attacks under conditions that combined jungle terrain, tropical disease, supply disruption, and the constant presence of American air power from the airfield they were trying to seize. The American Marines and Army soldiers holding the perimeter around Henderson Field fought in conditions that tested endurance as much as courage. The combination of combat, heat, malaria, inadequate rations during the periods when Japanese naval forces were most active in disrupting American supply runs, and the constant mental pressure of holding a position that everyone understood to be the strategic hinge of the entire South Pacific campaign. Both sides fought with a ferocity that reflected the stakes they understood to be present. Neither side was willing to let Guadalcanal go without exhausting its capacity to contest it. The logistics of Guadalcanal exposed one of the critical differences between American and Japanese strategic position as 1942 moved into its final months. Japan ran supply missions to its forces on Guadalcanal using destroyers. Fast, capable ships that could make high-speed runs down the slot between the islands at night, deliver supplies, and be clear of the range of Henderson Field's aircraft before dawn. American sailors named these operations the Tokyo Express, a name that conveyed both their regularity and their eerie efficiency. But destroyers are not freighters. The quantities of food, ammunition, and medical supplies that destroyer runs could deliver were insufficient to support the size of the Japanese garrisons that was being committed to Guadalcanal. Japanese troops on the island were chronically undersupplied throughout the campaign, and the effects, malnutrition, disease, collapse of combat effectiveness, accumulated relentlessly. The United States, by contrast, was building the logistical infrastructure across the South Pacific that would sustain offensive operations for the remainder of the war. The difference in industrial and logistical capacity, which Yamamoto had warned about before Pearl Harbor, was now beginning to express itself in the specific daily material terms of how many calories a soldier had to eat and how many rounds of ammunition he had to fire. The naval battle of Guadalcanal in November of 1942 was the campaign's most violent naval engagement and its strategic turning point. Over 2 nights and the daylight hours between them, American and Japanese surface forces fought a series of engagements in the waters off Guadalcanal that were, by the standards of any naval history, unusually intense and costly. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott were both killed during the first night's fighting, a measure of how close range and chaotic the engagement was. Japanese battleships bombarded Henderson Field, inflicting serious damage on the aircraft and facilities there. But American forces, at very high cost, prevented the landing of heavy reinforcements that Japan needed to mount a renewed ground offensive of sufficient strength to take the airfield. The Japanese convoy that had been assembled to land troops and heavy equipment on Guadalcanal was caught during daylight and destroyed by aircraft from Henderson Field and from the carrier Enterprise. The reinforcement Japan needed to tip the balance on the ground never arrived. The strategic decision of the Guadalcanal campaign had been reached, though weeks of fighting remained before the island was fully secured. Japan evacuated its surviving forces from Guadalcanal in early February of 1943, a skillfully executed operation that successfully removed approximately 10,000 men under conditions of American air and sea superiority. The evacuation was a tactical success in the narrow sense that most of the surviving troops were recovered rather than captured, but the strategic reality it represented was stark. Japan had committed enormous resources: ships, aircraft, experienced pilots, ground troops, to retaking Guadalcanal, had failed to do so, and was now withdrawing from the island it had set out to recapture. The 6 months of the Guadalcanal campaign had cost Japan more than it could afford in the specific currencies: carrier aircraft, experienced air crews, surface combatants, that its strategic position most required. When the last Japanese destroyer cleared the waters off Guadalcanal in the early hours of the 7th of February, 1943, the second major turning point of the Pacific War had been passed. Midway had stopped the Japanese advance. Guadalcanal reversed it. The men who survived Guadalcanal on both sides carried the campaign with them in ways that remained visible decades later. It was a different kind of war from Midway: slower, more grinding, more intimate in its suffering, less susceptible to being captured in a clean narrative of decision and consequence. There was no single morning on Guadalcanal when the outcome was determined in 5 minutes. There were 6 months of accumulating attrition, of men dying of malaria as well as combat, of ships settling into Iron Bottom Sound one after another, of Henderson Field's aircraft taking off from a damaged, cratered runway, because the alternative was not taking off at all. It was exactly the kind of war that Japan's strategic planners had been most anxious to avoid: a sustained, resource-intensive, grinding contest that measured national industrial capacity as much as military skill. And it was exactly the kind of war, as Yamamoto had warned before it began, that Japan could not win. Chapter 14. The Factory Floor: America's Industrial Reckoning. There is a version of the Pacific War story that focuses almost entirely on the men who fought it: the pilots, the sailors, the Marines, the soldiers. That version is true and important and must be told. But it is incomplete without the other version: the story of the factory floors in Detroit and Seattle and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the dry docks at Newport News and Camden, the training fields in Pensacola and Corpus Christi, the administrative machinery that took a peacetime economy and converted it, in a matter of months, into the most productive war-making apparatus in human history. The Battle of Midway was won partly by intelligence and partly by courage. The battles that followed Midway were won by all of that, and by production. The numbers that tell the story of American wartime industrial output are so large that they begin to lose meaning unless you anchor them to the specific things they produced and what those things made possible in the Pacific. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the United States Navy had 7 fleet carriers in commission or nearly complete. Japan had 10 fleet carriers, plus a number of smaller vessels. By December of 1943, 2 years later, the United States Navy had commissioned a number of new fleet and light carriers that fundamentally altered the balance of carrier aviation in the Pacific. The Essex-class fleet carriers, which began entering service in late 1942 and accelerated through 1943 and 1944, were larger, faster, and more capable in nearly every respect than the carriers that had fought at Midway. The Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls to accelerate delivery, added further capacity. Japan, by contrast, was attempting to replace 4 fleet carriers lost at Midway and the operational attrition of the Guadalcanal campaign with a shipbuilding program that simply could not match American output. The gap was not a matter of quality or design. It was a matter of industrial capacity. The number of dry docks, the tonnage of steel, the size of the trained workforce, the scale of the supporting supply chain. The aircraft production comparison was equally stark. American aircraft factories were producing, by the height of wartime production in 1943 and 1944, numbers of combat aircraft per month that exceeded Japan's entire annual production targets. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which began replacing the F-4F Wildcat in American carrier squadrons through 1943, was designed specifically around the performance envelope of the Mitsubishi Zero. Faster, more heavily armed, more capable at altitude, and far more survivable. The Hellcat gave American carrier aviators the aircraft they had lacked at Midway, and it gave them in numbers that Japanese production could not match. By the time the Essex-class carriers were deploying with full Hellcat air groups in 1943 and 1944, Japan was trying to defend a Pacific perimeter with air groups depleted by attrition and rebuilt with pilots whose training, by wartime necessity, had been compressed to a fraction of the pre-war standard. The pilot training contrast is perhaps the most consequence industrial comparison of the entire Pacific War. Japan's pre-war pilot training program was designed to produce a relatively small number of highly skilled elite aviators. Men like the Kido Butais, veterans who had trained for years before the war began. This program produced pilots of exceptional individual quality. It was not designed to be scaled to wartime attrition rates. When the Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal collectively consumed several hundred of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots in the span of 6 months, the training pipeline did not have the capacity to replace them quickly. The new pilots Japan trained were younger, less experienced, and compressed through a program whose hours in the air had been reduced by fuel shortages and instructor limitations. American training, by contrast, was designed from early in the war with mass production in mind. The naval aviator pipeline was expanded aggressively. Training bases multiplied. Instructors were drawn from the most experienced combat veterans, and the number of hours a pilot logged before his first combat deployment was maintained at levels that produced genuine competence. The result was a steady flow of capable, well-trained pilots into American carrier squadrons, arriving in growing numbers just as Japanese pilot quality was declining. The shipyard capacity comparison extends beyond carriers to every category of naval vessel. The United States built destroyers, cruisers, submarines, landing craft, and auxiliary vessels in quantities that transformed the logistics of the Pacific War. The fleet train, the oilers, ammunition ships, refrigerator ships, repair vessels, and floating dry docks that allowed American carrier task forces to operate indefinitely, far from their home bases, was itself an industrial achievement of major proportions. Japan had no equivalent capability. Japanese warships had to return to port for repairs and resupply on a timeline that limited their operational radius and restricted their ability to maintain continuous pressure on American positions. American task forces, supported by the fleet train, could operate continuously across the Pacific for weeks at a time. This operational flexibility, the ability to appear where Japan did not expect, to sustain pressure without the logistical pauses that Japanese planners could plan around, was a direct product of industrial investment in the supporting infrastructure of naval warfare, not just in the fighting ships themselves. The conversion of the American civilian economy to war production was managed with a degree of governmental coordination and industrial discipline that was in some ways as impressive as the military campaigns it supported. The War Production Board allocated materials, directed industrial capacity, and managed the transition from consumer to military production with a speed that surprised even American planners. Automobile factories converted to tank and aircraft production. Shipyards that had been building merchant vessels shifted to naval construction. The workforce expanded rapidly, incorporating women into manufacturing roles at a scale that permanently changed the demographics of American industrial labor, a transformation that was both a military necessity and a social development whose full implications extended far beyond the war itself. The Rosie the Riveter image that became a symbol of wartime production was, in the specific context of the Pacific War, not a metaphor. It was a description of the human beings who were building the carriers and the aircraft that would eventually overwhelm Japan's ability to resist. The contrast with Japan's economic situation could not have been more pointed. Japan's industrial base was smaller, more concentrated, more dependent on imported raw materials, and less flexible in its capacity to redirect civilian production to military needs. The strategic decision to go to war with the United States had been made partly on the calculation that seizure of the resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia, the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber of Malaya, the metals of the Philippines, would provide the raw material base for sustained war production. This calculation was not entirely wrong, but it underestimated two critical factors. First, the logistical challenge of moving raw materials from the Southeast Asian periphery to the Japanese home islands in the face of American submarine warfare was far greater than anticipated. Second, and more fundamentally, the American industrial base was simply so large, so well organized, and so capable of expansion that raw material access alone could not close the gap. Japan was fighting an industrial war against the world's largest industrial economy, and the disparity expressed itself in specific, lethal terms on every battlefield in the Pacific. American submarine warfare, largely overlooked in the popular history of the Pacific, but recognized by strategic analysts as one of the decisive factors in the war's outcome, was a direct product of the industrial and technological capacity that the United States brought to bear. American submarines, equipped with radar, improved torpedoes, and trained crews, prosecuted a relentless campaign against Japanese merchant shipping and naval vessels throughout the war. The effects accumulated across years. Japanese oil imports dropped, food imports dropped. The industrial raw materials that the Southeast Asian conquests were supposed to provide became harder and harder to deliver to the home islands. The submarine campaign was not a single dramatic battle. It was a slow strangulation, largely invisible to the civilian populations on both sides, that degraded Japan's war-making capacity month by month. By 1944, Japanese merchant marine losses to American submarines were severe enough to compromise the supply of raw materials to Japanese industry in ways that affected production across every category of military equipment. The human cost of American wartime industrial production is easy to omit from the military narrative and important not to. The workers who built the Essex-class carriers and the Hellcat fighters and the diesel submarines were not risking their lives in the same sense as the pilots who flew from those carriers, but they were working extended shifts in conditions of industrial hazard, separated from family members serving overseas, subject to the rationing and disruption of a wartime economy, and motivated by an understanding of the stakes that was, by the accounts that survive, largely genuine. The welders and riveters and machinists of the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, who gave the USS Yorktown back to the Pacific Fleet in 72 hours, were not anomalies. They were representative of what American industrial labor produced at wartime intensity. Output that was, by any objective assessment, the decisive material factor in the Pacific War's outcome. By the end of 1943, the material balance of the Pacific War had shifted beyond any possibility of Japanese reversal. The carrier fleet Japan had lost at Midway had not been replaced in kind, while the American carrier fleet had grown to a size that Yamamoto's pre-war warnings had described, but that Japan's planning had hoped to forestall through a decisive early victory that never came. The industrial reckoning that Midway made inevitable was not dramatic in the way that the battle itself was dramatic. It was relentless, cumulative, and irreversible. The factory floors of America were, in the deepest sense, the continuation of what the dive bombers had begun over the Kido Butai on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942. The bombers broke the Kido Butai's present. The factories guaranteed that it had no future. Chapter 15, The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The final destruction of Japanese carrier aviation by the summer of 1944. The Pacific War had traveled an enormous distance from the 2-year-old morning, when 3 American carriers waited at Point Luck, northeast of Midway. The geography of the conflict had moved thousands of kilometers westward through island-hopping campaigns across the Solomons, up through the Central Pacific, through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, and the assault on the Mariana Islands. The American carrier fleet that sailed into the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 bore only a superficial resemblance to the improvised force that had fought at Midway, in size, in equipment, in organization, and in the accumulated operational experience of 2 years of Pacific combat. Task Force 58, the Fast Carrier Task Force, under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, comprised 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers, with more than 900 aircraft embarked. It was the most powerful carrier force the world had yet seen, and it was about to meet what remained of Japanese carrier aviation in the last fleet engagement that Japan would be able to mount as anything resembling an equal contest. Japan had been building toward a decisive carrier battle throughout the months following Midway and Guadalcanal. The first mobile fleet, assembled under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, represented Japan's attempt to reconstitute carrier aviation on a competitive basis. 9 carriers had been assembled, equipped with a combination of veteran and newly trained pilots, with a total aircraft complement of roughly 430. Japan's plan for the engagement, designated AGO, combined carrier air attacks with land-based aircraft from the Mariana Islands and a tactical doctrine that used the longer range of Japanese carrier aircraft to strike American carriers before American aircraft could reach the Japanese fleet in return. On paper, the range advantage was real. In practice, It depended on a quality of aircrew execution that Japanese carrier aviation, after the attrition of Midway and Guadalcanal and the subsequent campaigns, was no longer able to deliver. The contrast in pilot quality between the two sides in June of 1944 was the starkest it had been at any point in the Pacific War. American carrier pilots were, by this stage of the war, products of a training pipeline that combined substantial flight hours with systematic instruction in the specific tactical challenges of carrier combat. The Hellcat pilots of Task Force 58 had, in many cases, experience from the carrier battles of 1943, the Rabaul raids, the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns, that had given them combat seasoning before the Philippine Sea engagement. Japanese carrier pilots, by contrast, were in many cases products of a compressed training program that had cut flight hours drastically to accelerate replacement of the losses sustained at Midway and in the subsequent campaigns. The individual exceptions existed on both sides. There were experienced Japanese pilots in the Philippine Sea, and there were inexperienced American ones. But the aggregates told the story. Japanese aircrew were, on average, less able to execute the complex tactical requirements of carrier aviation under combat conditions than their opponents. The engagement that unfolded on the 19th and 20th of June, 1944, in the waters east of the Mariana Islands, has been remembered by American participants with a description that does not appear in any operational order. The Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name, coined by aircrew returning from the engagement, captured in two words the lopsided nature of what happened when Japanese carrier aircraft, flying in formations that experienced American fighter controllers were able to track on radar, were met by Hellcat fighters, directed with precision to interception points before the Japanese aircraft could reach the American carriers. The result was a slaughter of the attacking formations. Japanese losses across the two-day engagement totaled approximately 395 aircraft. American losses in air combat totaled approximately 30 aircraft. The disparity was not primarily a product of equipment differences, though the Hellcat's superiority over the Zero was a contributing factor. It was primarily a product of the training gap. The radar-directed fighter control system that American carriers had developed and refined over 2 years of combat, and the accumulated organizational learning that the American carrier force had bought through its losses at Midway and in the battles that followed. Japan lost 3 carriers during the Philippine Sea engagement, the Taiho, the Shokaku, and the Hyo, to American submarine attacks and aircraft. The Shokaku, whose damage at the Coral Sea had kept her out of Midway and whose survival had seemed, in June of 1942, to represent some measure of compensation for Japan's carrier losses, was sunk in the Philippine Sea 2 years later by an American submarine. Her loss closed a loop that began at the Coral Sea. Japan's carrier aircraft losses in the Philippine Sea were catastrophic in the specific sense that most of the experienced pilots who had survived Midway and the subsequent campaigns were now gone. The pilots lost over the Marianas included many of the men Japan had been most carefully preserving and training since Midway, the nucleus around which it had hoped to rebuild its carrier aviation capability. After the Philippine Sea, there was no realistic prospect of Japan reconstituting carrier aviation as a genuine offensive force. The trajectory that Midway had established had arrived at its destination. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944 was, in terms of total ships involved, the largest naval battle in history. It involved Japanese attempts to destroy the American invasion fleet, supporting the landing in the Philippines through a complex, multi-pronged operation that used the remaining Japanese carriers as decoys, deliberately sacrificing them to draw American fast carriers away from the invasion area, while surface forces attempted to destroy the landing fleet. The fact that Japan's carriers were used as bait rather than as offensive weapons is the most precise possible measure of what Midway and its consequences had done to Japanese naval aviation. The carriers were still present. They carried aircraft and pilots, but the quality and quantity of their air groups were so depleted relative to what they had been in June of 1942 that their best use in Japanese operational planning was to attract the attention of the enemy rather than to fight him. This was the final expression of the attrition that had begun when the dive bombers found the Kido Butai. The carriers that Japanese admirals had built their strategy around for a decade had become, by October of 1944, instruments of misdirection rather than instruments of power. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended in a decisive American victory. The effective destruction of Japan's ability to contest American naval operations in the Philippine Sea, and the loss of more Japanese capital ships than any single engagement since Midway. The Imperial Japanese Navy that emerged from Leyte Gulf was no longer capable of mounting a conventional fleet action. What remained of Japanese naval aviation increasingly turned to special attack tactics, the tactic the Americans called kamikaze, which reflected, in its very conception, the acknowledgement that conventional carrier air operations were no longer viable against the defenses that American carriers and their escort forces had built over 2 years of combat learning. The kamikaze was a response to the exhaustion of conventional options, and it was a response that extracted real costs from American forces in the final year of the war. But it was not a strategy that could reverse the outcome of the war. It was the last tactical innovation available to a navy that had been defeated strategically in June of 1942. And the full weight of that defeat was only now becoming undeniable. The symmetry between Midway and the Marianas Turkey Shoot is not something that history constructed after the fact. It was something that participants on both sides recognized with clarity. The pilots who had survived Midway and gone on to fly in the Marianas engagement knew what the intervening 2 years had built. The Japanese officers who analyzed the Marianas losses knew, with a certainty they could no longer argue away, that the trajectory of the Pacific War had been set on the 4th of June, 1942. The Turkey Shoot was not the cause of Japan's carrier aviation crisis. It was the consequence of decisions made and losses sustained across 2 years of accumulating attrition. Midway was the cause. Everything that followed was the working out of what Midway had made inevitable. The human geography of Japanese carrier aviation by the summer of 1944 tells a story of institutional memory lost on a scale that goes beyond any individual battle. The pilots of the Kido Butai, who had survived Pearl Harbor and the subsequent months of Pacific combat, had represented the most experienced carrier air force in the world when they flew over Midway. Most of them died there, or in the months that followed. Their replacements were trained with urgency rather than thoroughness. The replacements' replacements were trained with even more urgency and even less thoroughness. By the Philippine Sea, the gap between Japanese and American pilot quality had become so large that tactics and equipment could not bridge it. The training pipeline that Japan had not built before the war and could not build quickly enough during it had proven to be as decisive a factor in the Pacific War's outcome as any carrier or any aircraft. The knowledge and experience that experienced aviators carry cannot be manufactured quickly. It can only be accumulated slowly, and it can be destroyed in moments. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War's result was no longer in genuine doubt among those who understood its material dimensions. Japan retained the capacity to make the war's conclusion expensive in lives on both sides. The kamikaze campaign, the expected ferocity of any invasion of the home islands, the demonstrated willingness of Japanese forces to accept casualty rates that would have broken any Western military force. All of these factors argued that the remaining distance to victory would be paid in blood on a scale that planners could only approximate. What they could not change was the direction. From the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, the direction had been set. The 4 carriers burning in the Central Pacific had not ended the war, but they had determined its end. Chapter 16. The men behind the battle, voices, memory, and human cost wars are decided by strategy industry and intelligence and weather, and the 10,000 contingencies that no planning document can anticipate. But they are fought by people, specific individual human beings who had lives before the battle, and, for those who survived, lives after it. The Battle of Midway left behind a human record that is, in many ways, more complex and more interesting than the clean strategic narrative suggests. The men who fought at Midway carried different versions of the battle with them for the rest of their lives. Some of those versions align neatly with the historical account. Some do not. All of them are true in the sense that they are honest accounts of what those men experienced. The space between personal experience and historical record is one of the most important and least examined territories in the study of war, and Midway offers it in particularly rich measure. The survivor of Torpedo 8, Ensign George Gay, became one of the most visible human faces of the Midway story in the years following the battle. He had floated in the ocean for hours after his aircraft was shot down, watching the battle unfold from the water, watching the Japanese carriers burn, watching aircraft fall, watching the shape of the engagement from a perspective that no other American had. When he was rescued, he was the sole survivor of his squadron. 30 men had flown in those 15 aircraft. He was the one who came back, carrying that. The weight of being the survivor, the witness, the one who could speak for men who could no longer speak for themselves, is a burden that does not have a simple resolution and does not diminish with time. Gay spoke about his experience in the years after the war, gave interviews, participated in commemorations, and became in some ways a symbol of the torpedo squadron's sacrifice. Whether that public role adequately captured his interior experience is something that only he could know, and he is gone. Commander Joseph Rochefort's post-war experience stands as one of the more instructive examples of how military institutions deal with individuals whose unconventional methods produced results that the institution's conventional procedures had failed to anticipate. Rochefort was not a typical naval officer in his professional style. He worked in a bathrobe. He kept irregular hours. He disagreed openly with the Naval Intelligence Directorate in Washington at a moment. When disagreeing openly with Washington carried genuine, professional risk. He was right, and the institutional forces that he had disagreed with ensured that his rightness was not rewarded in any conventional sense during his lifetime. His transfer from Station HYPO to a floating dry dock command in California after Midway was understood by everyone involved to be what it was: is a reassignment that removed an inconvenient person from a role in which his competence was undeniable. The posthumous Distinguished Service Medal, awarded decades later, restored something to the historical record. It could not restore anything to the man. His story belongs in the documentary record of Midway, not as a grievance to be litigated, but as an honest account of how institutions and individuals interact when the individual is both necessary and uncomfortable. The Japanese survivors of Midway faced a different kind of burden. The burden of defeat in a culture that had not prepared its military personnel for the possibility of comprehensive failure, and that actively suppressed public acknowledgement of what had happened. The officers and men who came back from the Kido Butai's burning carriers returned to Japan in secrecy. They were quarantined from the general population, prohibited from speaking about the battle, and in some cases assigned to posts where their knowledge of the defeat would not spread. This institutional management of failure, understandable from the perspective of wartime morale, deeply damaging from the perspective of institutional learning, meant that the Japanese Navy's ability to absorb the lessons of Midway was compromised from the start. Some officers drew the right conclusions and attempted to implement changes. Others were prevented from doing so by the same institutional culture that had suppressed news of the defeat. The gap between what Midway should have taught and what it actually changed in Japanese practice is one of the sadder aspects of the battle's aftermath. The air crews of the American carrier squadrons who survived Midway went on to fight in every subsequent Pacific Theater campaign. The Guadalcanal campaign, the Central Pacific Drive, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. A number of them did not survive those subsequent campaigns. The casualty rate among carrier aviators across the full arc of the Pacific War was high enough that survival at Midway was no guarantee of survival in the months and years that followed. The men who made it through the entire Pacific War, from Pearl Harbor to the Japanese surrender, and then came home to the United States to resume civilian lives, carried a composite experience of sustained danger and sustained loss that the peacetime society they returned to had no real framework for fully absorbing. The transition from years of Pacific combat to peacetime America was managed, for most of these men, with the particular stoicism that their generation and their culture emphasized. A stoicism that sometimes served them well, and sometimes simply meant that what they had seen and done remained unprocessed, in a silence that lasted the rest of their lives. The Japanese naval officers who analyzed the Battle of Midway in the years and decades following the war did so with an intellectual honesty that, in some cases, exceeded the candor that the post-war period initially made possible in Japan. Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, and who was aboard the Akagi at Midway when the bombs hit, collaborated with Masatake Okumiya on a Japanese account of the battle that was published in the 1950s, and became one of the most important primary sources in the battle's historiography. The book was honest about Japanese errors and honest about the quality of the American intelligence achievement. That honesty was, in the context of the immediate post-war years, a notable act of professional candor. Fuchida's account does not excuse Japanese command failures, but it contextualizes them within the conditions of the engagement rather than using hindsight as a prosecutorial tool. It remains one of the few first-hand Japanese accounts of the battle at the command level, and its perspective is irreplaceable. The physical memorials to Midway exist in several forms and several locations. The Midway Atoll itself, now a national wildlife refuge, is home to one of the world's largest Laysan albatross colonies, a biological community that is, in its own way, as remarkable as the historical events that the atoll witnessed. The albatrosses nest on the same ground where Marines and Navy personnel lived and fought in 1942. They are indifferent to history in the way that only living things can be, and their presence on the atoll has something to say, something not easily articulated, about the relationship between the events that humans impose on places and the life that continues in those places, regardless. The USS Yorktown is commemorated at the Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. Not the Yorktown that fought at Midway, which lies in more than 5,000 meters of water in the Central Pacific, but a later Essex-class carrier that carried the name forward. The name itself is a form of institutional memory, a way of insisting that the ship and the people who served in her are not forgotten. The historiography of Midway has evolved substantially since the first accounts appeared in the 1940s and 50s. Earlier histories, written while many participants were alive, and much documentary material was still classified, necessarily reflected the limitations of available evidence. Later scholarship, particularly the work of Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, whose research into Japanese sources produced a substantially revised understanding of events on the Kido Butai's hangar decks, corrected important errors that had become embedded in the standard account, and replaced them with a more nuanced and more accurate picture. The historians who have worked on Midway for decades have done something important. They have distinguished between what the participants understood at the time and what the documentary record, examined with the benefit of both time and access to sources from both sides, actually shows. Those two things are not always the same, and the gap between them is where the most interesting historical questions live. The Battle of Midway has been the subject of two major Hollywood productions: a 1976 film that used a combination of staged sequences and documentary footage, and a 2019 production that employed modern visual effects to recreate the aerial and naval combat with a fidelity that earlier technology could not achieve. Both films have been assessed by historians with mixed verdicts, praised for bringing the story to wide audiences, criticized for specific inaccuracies, and for the inevitable compression and dramatization that feature film narrative requires. The existence of multiple major film treatments of a single naval battle is itself a measure of Midway's hold on popular imagination, a hold that reflects something real about the battle's nature. It has the elements that narrative demands: outnumbered defenders, intelligence triumph, individual sacrifice, pivotal decisions made under pressure, and an outcome so improbable by pre-war accounting that its occurrence still generates genuine awe. The films are an imperfect medium for the full truth of the battle. They are also evidence that the full truth of the battle has never lost its power to compel attention. The men of Midway, American and Japanese, pilot and sailor and codebreaker and shipyard worker, are mostly gone now. The last of the direct participants have passed from the living record into the documentary one, and the battle now exists entirely in the territory of history rather than of living memory. That transition from a story that living people remember to a story that documents preserve is one that every historical event makes eventually. What survives the transition is not everything that happened, and not even everything that mattered. What survives is what was recorded, what was analyzed, and what was understood to be worth passing forward to generations that would not be there to see it for themselves. The Battle of Midway survives in that form. in archives and oral histories, and published accounts, and the careful work of historians who spent careers understanding it. It is enough. The shape of what happened on the 4th of June, 1942, is clear enough to teach and important enough to teach, and that is what this documentary has tried to do. Chapter 17, The Long Shadow, Midway's Legacy. In Naval Doctrine, the Battle of Midway did not simply alter the balance of power in the Pacific War. It became, in the decades that followed, one of the most studied military engagements in the curriculum of war colleges and staff academies around the world. The battle is taught not because its specific tactical circumstances are likely to recur. The age of fleet carrier engagements decided by dive. Bombers is as finished as the age of the longbow, but because the principles it illustrates about intelligence, command decision-making, operational planning, and the relationship between preparation and performance are portable across every era of warfare. The lessons of Midway have been extracted, analyzed, reanalyzed, and debated in military educational institutions for more than 80 years, and the debate is still going. That sustained attention is not nostalgia. It is recognition that the questions Midway raises are permanent questions, not period ones. The intelligence lesson of Midway is the one most consistently cited in contemporary military doctrine, and it deserves to be. Station HYPO demonstrated that signals intelligence. The collection and analysis of an enemy's communications can provide an advantage that no amount of firepower can generate on its own. Knowing where the enemy is going is worth, in certain circumstances, more than having 3 times his number of ships. The investment that the United States made in cryptanalysis before and during the Second World War, the development of analytical methods, the training of linguists and mathematicians, the organizational infrastructure to collect and process signal traffic, produced returns that were transformative at Midway and continued to produce returns across every subsequent theater of the war. The specific technical means have changed utterly in the 80 years since Midway. The principle that intelligence is a force multiplier whose value can exceed that of conventional military capability has not changed at all. Every modern military establishment that maintains a signals intelligence capability is in some sense acting on the lesson of Joseph Rochefort's basement. The operational lesson about the dangers of plan complexity is equally durable. Yamamoto's plan for the Midway operation was, as historians and military analysts have noted repeatedly in the decades since the battle, a plan that was too clever for its own good. One that distributed forces across too wide an area, relied on too many sequential events, proceeding as designed, and built in no effective mechanism for responding to the unexpected. The basic principle that military plans must account for the fact that the enemy will not behave as anticipated, and that plans which work only if everything goes right are plans that will fail under combat conditions, is as applicable to modern joint operations as it was to the Kido Butai in June of 1942. The corollary principle, that simple plans, clearly communicated and executed by commanders with sufficient judgment to adapt when circumstances change, outperform complex ones, appears in various formulations in the doctrine of virtually every modern military establishment. Midway is one of the case studies most often used to illustrate it, because the contrast between Yamamoto's Byzantine plan and Nimitz's straightforward directive is so clean. The damage control lessons of Midway had immediate and lasting impact on American naval practice. The Yorktown's survival through 2 separate attack waves, and the speed with which her crew managed to restore operational capability after the first wave's bomb hits reflected the specific lessons drawn from the loss of the USS Lexington at the Coral Sea. Lessons about fuel system, isolation, fire suppression protocols, and the organization of damage control parties. Those lessons were institutionalized across the American carrier fleet in the months following Midway and refined through subsequent engagements. The broader principle that operational learning from failure, systematically applied, produces capability improvements that survive the losses that generated the learning, is one of the genuinely important insights about how military organizations develop effectiveness under wartime conditions. American naval aviation in the Pacific War was, in important respects, a learning organization. It assessed its failures honestly, extracted their lessons, and implemented changes that improved subsequent performance. The Yorktown's damage control performance at Midway was one of the most visible expressions of that organizational learning. The role of technological adaptation in the Battle of Midway and its aftermath has produced a specific and important body of doctrine around the relationship between equipment and training. The F-4F Wildcat that American carrier pilots flew at Midway was, in direct one-on-one comparison with the Mitsubishi Zero, inferior in certain key performance parameters. American pilots who survived early Pacific engagements did so partly through the THAC weave, a defensive formation tactic developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thack that compensated for the Wildcat's maneuverability disadvantage through coordinated section tactics. The tactic worked, but it was a workaround rather than a solution. The solution arrived when the Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered service, an aircraft designed from the ground up with knowledge of the Zero's capabilities, incorporating the lessons of 2 years of Pacific combat into its design specifications. The combination of better aircraft and the trained pilots produced by the expanded training pipeline transformed the air combat balance in the Pacific in a way that no single tactical innovation could have achieved alone. The lesson is about the relationship between technological development and human performance. Technology creates opportunity, but training and doctrine determine whether that opportunity is realized. The Battle of Midway also produced enduring lessons about the management of information under conditions of institutional competition. The conflict between Rochefort's Station HYPO and the Naval Intelligence Directorate in Washington. A conflict about which analytical teams' assessment of the Japanese target was correct, was resolved in Rochefort's favor by the AF deception operation and by events. But the institutional dynamic that allowed a technically superior analysis to be challenged and obstructed by organizational politics is one that modern intelligence communities have identified as a recurring vulnerability. The phenomenon of analysts whose conclusions are correct being overruled or marginalized because their conclusions conflict with the preferences or prior assessments of more senior institutions appears in intelligence histories from before and after Midway in every major intelligence failure and success of the post-war era. Military and intelligence organizations have developed various structural approaches to managing this vulnerability. Red teams, competitive analysis, structured disagreement processes, all of which reflect the lesson that institutional consensus is not the same thing as analytical accuracy, and that the cost of confusing the two can be catastrophic. The carrier task force doctrine that emerged from the Battle of Midway and the subsequent Pacific carrier engagements became the template for American carrier operations for the remainder of the Second World War, and for decades after it. The Fast Carrier Task Force. Multiple carriers operating together with cruiser and destroyer escorts, supported by a fleet train capable of sustaining operations far from home bases, employing radar-directed fighter control and coordinated strike doctrine, was refined through the engagements of 1942 and 1943 into a highly effective operational system. The Essex-class carriers that replaced and supplemented the Midway-era vessels were designed around this doctrine. The air groups that operated from them were trained within it. The operational concepts that guided American carrier employment in the Central Pacific Drive, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf all derived from lessons learned, often at painful cost, during and after Midway. When American carrier task forces conducted operations in the Pacific in the 21st century, they were doing so within an institutional framework whose foundations were laid in the battles of 1942. The contemporary relevance of Midway's intelligence lesson has been amplified rather than diminished by the revolution in signal collection and processing that the digital era has produced. Modern military establishments collect and process vastly more communications intelligence than anything available to Rochefort's team in 1942. The analytical challenges are different in character, managing the abundance of available information rather than the scarcity of it. But the fundamental insight remains the same. Accurate knowledge of enemy intentions and capabilities, derived from their own communications, provides advantages that no other single intelligence activity can match. The specific technical methods of JN-25 code breaking are historical curiosities. The principle that signals intelligence enables force multiplication, and that the investment required to maintain the capability pays. Returns that justify the cost is as valid in any contemporary operational context as it was when Rochefort confirmed that AF meant Midway by getting the Japanese to confirm it in their own traffic. The question of how the Battle of Midway should be understood in relation to subsequent American military history is one that does not have a single settled answer. It has been used to support arguments about the importance of intelligence investment, about the dangers of operational overconfidence, about the decisive role of industrial capacity, about the relationship between individual decision-making and systemic outcomes. All of these uses are legitimate because the battle genuinely does illustrate all of these things. The risk in any enduring historical example is that it gets flattened into a simple lesson, a morality tale with a clear application, at the cost of the complexity that made it historically significant. Midway was a complex event that produced a clear outcome, and the complexity is part of what makes it worth studying. A simplified Midway produces simplified lessons. The full Midway, with its hesitations, its failures, its costly sacrifices that achieved ambiguous immediate results, its moments of fortune as well as judgment, produces lessons that are more demanding and more durable. The shadow that Midway casts over American naval doctrine and over the broader study of 20th century warfare is long and not always comfortable. It is not only a shadow of triumph, it is also the shadow of the torpedo squadron pilots who did not come back, of Rochefort's posthumous medal, of the Yorktown lying in more than 5,000 meters of Pacific water. Any honest engagement with Midway requires sitting with both the triumph and the cost, and recognizing that they are not separate stories. They are the same story. The dive bombers found the Kido Butai because the torpedo bombers had pulled the Zeros down to altitude. The intelligence was only as good as Nimitz's willingness to act on it. The Yorktown's crew performed their damage control miracle because the Lexington's crew had paid the price that taught the lesson. In war, every achievement has its price, and the price is usually paid by someone other than the person who collects the achievement. Midway makes that truth visible, and the visibility is not comfortable, and the discomfort is exactly the point. Chapter 18. What Remains? The Battle of Midway and its Place in History. On the 23rd of May, 1998, a research vessel operating in the Central Pacific located the wreck of the USS Yorktown resting on the ocean floor at a depth of more than 5,000 meters in the waters where she had sunk on the 7th of June, 1942. The ship lay on her side, relatively intact, recognizable as the carrier she had been. Cameras sent down to survey the wreck found her flight deck still in place, her anti-aircraft gun mounts still present. The physical evidence of the battle she had fought preserved in the cold and darkness of the deep Pacific. The expedition was led by Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who had previously located the RMS Titanic, and its findings were widely reported. The images of the Yorktown on the ocean floor were, for the people who saw them, something more than archaeological documentation. They were a confrontation with the reality that the abstract language of history can obscure. That the battle happened in a specific place, to a specific ship, and that the place and the ship are still there. The discovery of the Yorktown's wreck prompted reflection on what it means to say that the Battle of Midway is historical. Everything that happened on the 4th of June, 1942, happened in the real world, in the physical ocean, to real ships, to real people who had names and families, and the particular unrepeatable specificity of individual human beings. The historical account that subsequent generations have constructed from documents and testimony and analysis is a representation of those events, not the events themselves. The gap between the representation and the reality is always present in historical study, but it is easy to forget. The photographs of the Yorktown's wreck make the forgetting harder. The ship is there. The battle was there. The men who died were there, and their names are in the record, and some of them have descendants who are alive today. History is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is an obligation to the specific people who lived through the events it describes. The Battle of Midway occupies a particular position in American national memory, one that has been stable enough across decades that it has become part of the shared cultural vocabulary of the country. The word Midway, for generations of Americans, carries a meaning that no extensive explanation is required to activate. It means the turning point. It means the moment when the improbable became actual. It means a particular kind of American story about outgunned determination and intelligence, and the refusal to accept the outcome that the arithmetic alone would suggest. That national memory is not wrong, exactly, but it is simplified in ways that matter. The actual Battle of Midway was messier, more costly, more contingent, and more dependent on specific individuals making specific decisions under specific pressures than the national memory version suggests. The gap between the simplified version and the full version is not a reason to dismiss the simplified version. It is a reason to know the full version so that what is being honored is the actual thing and not merely its legend. The role of Midway in the broader history of the Second World War can be stated with confidence. It was the decisive engagement of the Pacific Theater, in the sense that it altered the strategic trajectory of the Pacific War in a direction from which Japan could not recover. That statement is supportable and supported by this historical evidence. What is less frequently stated, but equally true, is that the Battle of Midway was itself enabled by and inseparable from everything that came before it. The months of intelligence work, the sacrifices at the Coral Sea, the repair of the Yorktown, the Doolittle raid's effect on Japanese planning, the decision in Washington to build and maintain a signals intelligence capability, the industrial commitment that kept the fleet supplied and the training programs running. Midway did not happen in isolation. It was the product of a system, imperfect, expensive, sustained at enormous human cost, that had been building for months before the battle and would continue building for years after it. The battle is the most visible point of the system's output. It is not the whole of what produced the victory. The Japanese defeat at Midway, examined from the perspective of the historians who have spent careers studying it, raises questions that resist comfortable resolution. Was it inevitable? Given the intelligence disparity and the structural flaws in Japan's plan? Or was it the product of specific contingencies? McCluskey's navigation decision, the late launch of Tone's scout plane, the timing of the torpedo attacks, that, had they fallen differently, might have produced a different outcome. The historians who have engaged most seriously with this question generally resist the determinist answer. They do not claim that American victory was inevitable from the moment Rochefort confirmed AF as Midway. They argue instead that the intelligence advantage shifted the probability distribution, made an American victory more likely, perhaps substantially more likely, without guaranteeing it. The 5 minutes over the Kido Butai were not a foregone conclusion. They were a moment that the preceding months had made possible, and that was then actualized by a chain of contingent decisions and events. The difference between possibility and actuality is where human agency lives, and it is where the battle's most interesting questions reside. The environmental history of Midway Atoll, which has become, in the decades since the Second World War, one of the most important seabird nesting sites in the Pacific, offers an unexpected perspective on the battle's long-term significance. The atoll that American forces defended in June of 1942 is today home to the largest Laysan albatross colony on Earth, along with numerous other seabird species. The sandbagged gun emplacements have weathered and subsided. The runway that Marine pilots used to scramble their fighters on the morning of the 4th of June is still present, though its military functions are long past. The atoll exists now primarily as a wildlife refuge, a place where the biological life of the central Pacific is protected and studied, where the albatrosses that nest there have no awareness of the events that once made the place significant to human history. The juxtaposition is not ironic so much as it is clarifying. The battle mattered enormously in human terms and within the human timescale. The ocean and its life continued regardless, as they always do, as they will continue when every participant and every document has finally passed from the world. The question of what we owe the dead of the Battle of Midway is not one that a documentary script can answer, because it is not ultimately a historical question. It is a moral one. What we can say is that the men who died at Midway, the torpedo squadron, pilots, the Yorktown's crew, the Marines on the island, the Japanese sailors and aviators who burned with their ships, died in the service of their country's competing claims on the Pacific, and that the outcome of their contest determined an enormous amount about how the subsequent history of the Pacific region unfolded. Whether those competing claims were just or unjust, wise or foolish, is a question for another kind of inquiry. What is not disputable is that the men who fought at Midway treated what they were doing with a seriousness that the historical record preserves with great clarity. They understood the stakes, they acted accordingly, and in the acting, they produced an outcome that changed the world, not by themselves, not through any single heroic act, but through the accumulation of all of their individual choices, each made in their own specific circumstances, under their own specific pressures, at the cost of whatever it cost them personally. That is how history is actually made, not in summaries, in moments, in people, in the specific and irreversible decisions that individuals make when the situation requires them to make one. The Battle of Midway ended at dusk on the 7th of June, 1942. The Pacific War went on for 3 more years and cost millions more lives before it was finished. But the direction in which those 3 years travelled was set to a very large degree by what happened over the Kido Butai on the morning of the 4th of June. The men who made that happen, in the basement at Pearl Harbor, in the dry dock where the Yorktown was repaired, in the cockpits of the dive bombers and the torpedo planes and the fighter escorts, knew they were doing something that mattered. They may not have known it mattered this much. History rarely tells you its own weight while you are inside it. It took the rest of the war, and then the decades of scholarship and analysis that followed, to measure the full dimensions of what happened in 5 minutes over the Central Pacific on a clear June morning, when 3 carriers burned and the world turned on its axis, and the long road home to peace, however costly and however far away, finally opened before the Pacific Fleet. The men at Point Luck had been lucky. They had also been extraordinary. The distinction, in this case, was never simple, and the full truth of it belongs to all of them.